Emily has always been Daddy's favorite daughter for as long as she can remember. Her father was everything to her, Daddy and Mommy, teacher and friend. Emily's mom died in childbirth, and the grief-stricken father at first did not even want to look at the child. Her grandmother told her that much later, apparently trying to make amends to his daughter, or maybe because Emily, growing up, became incredibly similar to her mother. Her father tried to give her everything to the maximum. He had the means to do so to the best of his ability. He was a very wealthy man, and before perestroika, when he headed a large factory, and after, when successfully corporatized it, became general director of a new Zhang, gradually took control of almost everything in his native city. He personally entered frontmen-owned factories, stores, gas stations, sanatoriums, hotels, and even a luxurious yacht club, the dream of his own childhood, the last adult toy. Emily grew up in conditions that most of her peers had a hard time even imagining. On the one hand, she had absolutely everything one could wish for, and on the other hand, a huge lack of communication. From a very young age, she was never left unsupervised for a minute. A whole staff of nannies closely followed the princess, shielding her from the slightest dangers. Preschooler Emily did not attend a regular kindergarten, and the most privileged ones did not attend either. In her father's opinion, it was a very dangerous place. Anyone could harm his adored daughter. Besides, knowing perfectly well the number of his ill-wishers, he could not allow his daughter to be somewhere without personal protection. Therefore, for his daughter, arranged kindergarten at home, his own mini garden, carefully selected several children of her age, and of course the parents of these children were his business partners, a little lower rank. Emily was the queen here, and she was well aware of that. She was allowed everything, and the others, adults and children alike, had to obey. In order for her daughter to go to school, Michael Johnson, that was the name of her father, ordered to create their own private school. After all, it was the only way to be sure of teachers, students, and security. All these categories of staff and students were subjected to the strictest multi-stage selection process. Thus, Emily Johnson lived in a world within a world, and in this world of her own, she continued to be a queen. Not once in her life did she experience what all ordinary children have. She was not alone in the store, did not ride her bike to her girlfriend on the nearest street, did not socialize with random people not known to her father. She was never alone anywhere at all. The stern and imposing shadows of security guards loomed everywhere. But the strange thing is that with such an unnatural way of life, Emily did not become a soulless monster without conscience and without warmth in her heart. Perhaps her character was influenced by the genes of her untimely departed mother, a very sweet, kind and kind-hearted woman, and her father, for all his faults, was not a bad man. He was just panic-stricken about losing his daughter. The second such loss he would not survive. What can a girl who is everything dream of? It would seem that such a girl should grow up to be either a soulless wastrel or cruel and calculating, not to live a real life. And there are many examples of this. Children of the rich, finally released into the light, squander the fortunes of their parents, make casual and dangerous connections, crash expensive cars and crashed in them themselves, ruin and break human destinies. But Emily somehow happily escaped it all. Deprived of real life, she learned it from books. The girl from a young age is very fond of reading avidly and swallow everything that was available to her. At first, not everything was available, but in the rapidly coming era of global internetization, Emily, having access to almost unlimited information, began to imagine, at least in theory, how the real world works. She was born a girl far from stupid, and by the age of 15, even her father's strictest prohibitions did not prevent her from learning what she wanted to know. And it was not only in those areas of life that all parents forbid all children at all times. Not at all. She was mostly interested in questions of social structure, history, religion, psychology, and similar things. Besides, she had her own hobby. Emily loved adventures, being deprived of the opportunity to experience at least the simplest of them. For example, a trip to a neighboring ravine or a campfire, or an ordinary walk in the woods for mushrooms. She swallowed tons of adventure novels, watched relevant movies, and even tried to write about distant countries, uncharted spaces, mysterious planets, and fairy tale creatures holding the keys to magical treasures. Reading again, dear favorite father, coming home, affectionately kissed his daughter on her fluffy head. What have you got here? Alice in Wonderland. It's a good book, and satisfied that his daughter was engaged in something safe and useful, smiled approvingly. Hi, Pirates of the Caribbean, jokingly said to the growing Emily, who watched Jack Sparrow and read The 15-Year-Old Captain, The Headless Horseman, and similar things. Dad, let's go somewhere in the jungle, Emily begged her father, or to the desert coast. What could happen to us there? There's no one for miles around. What makes you so sure that you can survive at least 2 days on a deserted coast? Laughed my father, turning everything into a joke. There are no toilets or hot water, and no one will feed us 3 times a day. So be it, Emily said. We'll cook on the fire ourselves. Do you know how to shoot, Dad? I've had to, he said, grinning evasively. You know, darling, we've already booked a fall trip to the Dead Sea, to the Radisson. Radisson, sighed the daughter, knowing in advance that a separate penthouse or bungalow awaits her there. 24-hour security, no other tourists. Around excursions only individual, stores only prestigious, that is, super expensive, where ordinary people are not allowed on the doorstep. Dad, I want to go for a walk, she pestered her father and Rebecca. We could take the bus to the center ourselves. I looked up the route. What could happen to us? Anything, father answered in a tone that brooked no objection. Anything can happen. You're too young to understand that. But they let the other children go out alone, Emily protested. Do I have to spend my whole life guarded behind a wall? You're not the others, her father replied suggestively, starting to get angry. And remember, you are my daughter, and I personally make sure that nothing happens to you. You see, there are too many people around here who want to hurt us. Why? Emily wondered. Because I have achieved so much in this life, her father explained. Envy is the reason why people are so cruel. They envy what we have. If only there were something to envy, Emily sighed softly to herself. It's like living in a prison. But any prisoner dreams of breaking out of any prison, of getting freedom, even from a golden cage with 3 meals a day. Emily was no exception to that rule. Teenagers can be very resourceful, and one day she simply escaped from her vigilant guards by quickly changing clothes in the restroom of a luxury store. It was a fashion show that day, and for that reason it was quite crowded. Socialites, young majors, and rich mothers who brought their daughters to admire the latest fashion collections and order something. Emily went into the restroom one person and came out a completely different person. She wore a brown curly wig, purchased in advance from an online store, different clothes and even glasses, not sunglasses, but with simple glasses, imitating a girl with ophthalmologic problems. She managed the transformation so well that the bodyguards did not even raise an eyebrow when this alien girl passed them and slipped into the street. It worked. In the public garden at the agreed place, Emily was waiting for her friend, who enjoyed a little more freedom. Yes, Emily was jumping up and down with excitement. Let's go to that cafe you told me about. The girls went out that day until 8:00. They didn't dare go any longer. The other girl had to be home by a certain time, but even those few hours were enough for Emily's father to get the whole town on its ear. But all efforts were in vain. No one ever found them. You see, Dad, Emily rejoiced the next day. When her father's first rage had subsided, nothing happened to us. But it could have, Michael argued. Anything could have happened. No one would even recognize me in this outfit, Emily laughed. I had colored lenses too. Honestly, did you recognize me when I got home? No, my father exhaled. I didn't recognize you at all. Yeah, Emily was over the moon, so I'm right. Please, Dad, just let me go for a walk once in a while. I'm not a canary that can stay in a cage all the time. Do you understand? The father only sighed heavily and looked at his growing daughter with regret and love. Of course, he knew perfectly well that he would not be able to put her under a golden castle or put her in a tower like Rapunzel. I wish he could. I guess I was 2, he stammered, unable to find the right words. Yes, Dad, Emily stroked his arm affectionately. Too much. I'm 15 now, you know. I'm going to be an adult soon. It's time to learn a little bit about the real world. How am I supposed to live in it if I don't know anything? But you're not going to go into the real world, are you? Dad's worried. I won't. Come on, Dad, don't worry. Emily was soft and pliant, infinitely pleased with her success. We'll work it out, won't we? She promised to tell me where she was at all times. I don't care if your big guy follows me around, but only to normal places. Okay, I'll go to the mall, they can sit in the back. I'll go to the movies, they can sit in the back. But just let me finally feel like a free man. Okay, the father gave in. Okay, daughter. Since that momentous day, Emily had enjoyed relative freedom. Of course, she hadn't expected a great result, but what she'd gotten was enough. Now she could sit with her friends in an ordinary cafe, go to the movies for the simplest session, take there a bucket of popcorn, and sit with all the usual people, laughing and thinking about nothing. The sullen shadows of the bulky bodyguards didn't embarrass her in the least. She was so used to them in her life that she hardly noticed them. Already being a university student, no. Her father had already failed to open his own university for his daughter. Emily and her friends often sat in a small and cozy place near her alma mater. By the way, one of the few that did not belong to her father. But that wasn't even the point. It was close to the university. You could skip an unnecessary pair and not be late for the next one. The food was pretty good, and the prices were quite reasonable. Emily could afford everything, of course, but others couldn't, and she was quite happy here. She was young and unassuming. That afternoon, they were studying for their art history test, and laughing, of course, all the usual. And then Penelope pulled out of her enormous bag some nice bucks. "What is it?" interested girls. "Tarot cards," proudly announced Penelope. "Do you want fortune-telling?" Art history was immediately completely forgotten, and fellow students with interest began to watch as Penelope Ratnikova importantly laid out unusual, much larger than a simple deck, cards. "This arcana is called the Magician," Penelope said with a mysterious look. "And this is the Hanged Man. What do they mean?" The girls simply fell in love with the beautiful and elegantly drawn pictures. "It depends," Penelope answered evasively. "It depends on the position, straight or upside down. You see, the card can lie like this, or maybe like this, and then everything is bad. Then the combination of arcana is very important. In short, there are many variants. Everyone has their own layout." "How do you know this?" one of the listeners asked. "My cousin's sister gave it to me. She and her parents came for vacation. They live in Houston. She has long been fond of these tarot cards, astrology and numerology." "That's very interesting," Emily said, furrowing her beautiful, smooth forehead. "But I don't think it's all true." "To believe or not to believe in fortune-telling is up to each person," Penelope parried with the look of a skillful professional. "But this tradition has been known since the Middle Ages. They came into the world together with gypsies. Kings and generals, favorites of emperors and world-famous magicians, famous actors and great artists used these cards. They decided the fate of the world." "You should be a writer, not a designer," Emily laughed. "You say it like it's written." "Thank you." Penelope was not embarrassed. "Let me make you a reckoning. Then we'll see if something will come true for you or not." "Come on," agreed skeptical Emily. "Why not? So, let's see." Penelope began with a concentrated look laid out on the table with a variety of pictures. "Let's make you a Celtic cross. It shows the very near future." "Well, what do we have here?" She began to turn over the pieces on the cards laid out shirt side up. "Oh, the Wheel of Fortune. Lovers. And what's this? The Emperor and Empress together? Wow." What? The girls were getting impatient to see what the verdict would be on Emily's cards. Wait. Penelope was deftly turning over the last of the pictures. King of Wands, 5 of Cups, 9 of Swords. "Oh, I'm an inexperienced fortune teller." Penelope looked at the smiling Emily carefully. "But, this is the first time I've ever had this. Usually I get something not quite definite or simple, ordinary. And this. I don't even know why so many strong cards came up together." "Maybe I did not mix well," suggested Penelope. "Well, come on already. Do not languish, do not endure." Another girl, "Emily, soon our couple. And we, by the way, also want to know what awaits us. So finish it." "Okay." Penelope sighed, and as if suddenly resolved, raised her eyes to Emily. "In short, soon you will meet the king, and between you will flare up a fiery passion. Then your life will change so much that it will seem unbelievable, and you will suffer and feel remorse, but you will still follow your lover, even though he is not what you thought he was." And then she was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts or her wits. "And besides, you'll be a priestess." Emily was laughing, sliding under the table in convulsions. The other girls kept up. The whole thing seemed ridiculous and silly. Fortune-telling, priests, priestesses. "What a gypsy!" Emily shrieked and howled with laughter. "I did not insult you." Penelope took offense. "I didn't make it all up. The cards say so. What can I do?" "Don't fill your head with nonsense," Emily said with a laugh. She stood up. "Come on, we're already late." The girls paid the bill, and a motley flock of girls scurried out of the cafe, chirping happily. They headed for their alma mater. The next class was art history, which they should have been preparing for instead of solitaire. The auditorium was located on the 3rd floor of the university. They were about to climb the wide staircase, when suddenly Emily, who was walking ahead of them, stopped like a stumbling block. A little more, and Penelope, who followed her, would have fallen down the stairs from the unexpected obstacle. "What are you?" she shrieked indignantly. "Getting stuck on a flat spot almost dropped me." But Emily didn't hear her. She couldn't hear or see anything at all, except the searing stare of fiery black eyes, staring at her point blank. The owner of those eyes stood directly across from her in the middle of the recreation, and looked as if they had known each other for a long time. And to top it off, Emily sensed a commanding expression in that gaze, even though not a single word had been spoken. The boy was very handsome with some wild, primordial, unbridled beauty. Black wavy hair, in which it was as if sparks were slipping through, so that it seemed not as if it were blue-black, but rather the color of very dark polished wood. And there was the same light in his eyes, a mysterious spark hidden in the abyss of black pupils. He was tall, stately, but still youthfully supple. He stood as if he were the master of the place, free, independent, dignified. "Who is it?" Penelope whispered, poking her head out from behind Emily's shoulder. "What a handsome man. Something we have not seen him here before." And the rest of the girls were also interested in looking at the strange, handsome man. And he was only looking at Emily, and she was looking at him. And between these two almost palpably ran an electric discharge, which was visible and clear not only to them, but also to everyone around them. The seconds were rushing by, the cheerful students hurrying around. Someone was hurrying somewhere, and the two, suddenly stopped by some powerful human force, stood motionless, like statues frozen momentarily, and looked at each other without taking their eyes off each other. "Shall we go?" Penelope asked hesitantly, pulling Emily by the sleeve. "Enough already. It looks indecent. Let's go." "Why?" Emily, as if out of a stupor. "What did you say?" "I said stop staring at that guy." "Everyone's already staring at you too. We're about to start our date. Or do you want Tarasov to get you in trouble?" "Let's go," an automatic agreed Emily and gave herself to take away. And while she and Penelope, catching up with the others, walked down the long corridor, which like a branch of a full-flowing river flowed out of the wide recreation, Emily felt the back of her neck burning gaze of that guy. It was like hot needles stinging her skin. In art history, Emily sat like a drowning woman, barely able to write half of her ticket. She was still there, in the recreation room near the staircase, where she'd been pierced by that striking gaze. Such unusual eyes, never seen before, but at the same time strangely familiar. Emily caught herself thinking that she wasn't writing anything at all. Her pen lay nearby, and she sat staring out the window. Throwing a glance at the audience, she noticed that everyone was still hard at work on the test. She got up, handed in her work, and left the room, accompanied by the surprised looks of her classmates. He was sitting quietly on the couch in the completely empty recreation room. Emily saw him, barely out from around the corner of the hallway. She wasn't even surprised. Somehow she even relaxed, let go. Gone was the first terrible tension she'd felt from the encounter. Emily approached him like a submissive, recognizing her master, a young horse that had accidentally escaped from the herd into the wild. "Hello," Rami said to her, smiling. "I'm glad to see you." Hello." Emily smiled back at him, and an incomprehensible joy pierced her whole being. But at the same time, she felt unusually uneasy, and hot goosebumps ran from her temples to her feet. "What did you call me?" she asked him, and without waiting for an answer, added, "My name is Emily." Good, he smiled again. "And I'm Stefan." "Stefan," she repeated thoughtfully, as if tasting the name. "It's very beautiful and so unusual. You must be a foreigner." "Yes," agreed the boy, "in a way." "You speak Russian well," Emily praised him, almost without an accent. "Do you study here?" "It's strange, but I've never seen you before." "My family is in town on business for quite a while," Stefan explained. "I've decided to take an arts and crafts class for the time being, so as not to waste any time." "Oh, you're an extra," Emily realized. "I see. Where are you studying?" "I've already finished my education at home," Stefan said with dignity, as if he was presenting his title. "Really?" Emily looked at him questioningly. He didn't look more than 20, but who knows, maybe he just looked that young. "You look a lot like an Italian," she said suddenly. "You do." I don't know why Stefan grinned, almost guessed it. "But tell me," she asked, like a little girl who wants to know someone else's secret. "If you know too much, you'll grow old," Stefan laughed. He threw back his head and showed his teeth, which were dazzling white. "Let's go." He took her hand and led the way. Emily followed him calmly and happily, not even asking where they were going. She felt so good, so safe. Yes, safe. She felt like she was behind a stone wall with this complete stranger, like she'd met a relative she just hadn't seen in a long time. They walked out of the building, across the spacious university grounds, and down an alley lined with blue spruce trees and rose bushes to the parking lot. The alarm beeped, and the automatic doors of a dazzling white-beamed sports car opened on their own, swinging sideways and upward. Not even her father had such a car. Cool, Emily marveled, taking a seat in the front seat, which was covered in soft, creamy leather. And then an unfortunate thought scratched her mind. Something seemed wrong with everything that was happening. What if? Emily guessed and shrieked out loud, "Shit, where's Dad's surveillance team?" Sleeping, Stefan told her calmly, as if he knew what she was talking about. Sleeping, Emily marveled, and, following Stefan's pointing gesture, suddenly saw her two bodyguards, who had been following her around like glue since this morning. The two of them, leaning against each other like little kids tired from a walk, were sleeping on a bench in the parking lot, in the shade next to the car Emily had come here in. "What's wrong with them?" Emily asked Stefan in a whisper, as if afraid to wake them. "I don't know," he shrugged. "It's hot today. They must be tired." "Wow," she laughed uncontrollably, and leaned back in the comfortable seat and laughed, until she was in tears as Stefan drove out of the narrow driveway of the university parking lot. "Fuck me. And how many years I've lived, I've never had anything like this, so I'm completely free." She leaned out of the open car window and shouted triumphantly, "Free, free." Stefan looked at her, smiling. He was obviously very pleased. Emily sat perfectly happy, and with her cheek against the warm breeze of the late spring, looked forward with pleasure. The car, propelled by Stefan's skillful hand, sped along like a young, exuberant horse, leaving the other cars far behind. They had already passed the city limits, swept over the long bridge with its openwork tile of cast iron spans over the wide river, and on the country road they sped off into the distance, past villages and hamlets painted in all shades of green, past lakes, rivulets, and streams, through the tops of sloping trees, forests, and plantings overhanging the narrow two-lane highway. Emily didn't even ask where they were going. She didn't care. A heady feeling of complete freedom swept over her and enveloped her from head to toe in a joyous haze. That was the way to fly and fly, like a free bird, and never stop. However, they did stop near a nice tourist complex, lost somewhere away from the big road. "The Coast of Childhood," Emily read the sign aloud. "What is it?" She turned to Stefan, pulling a large bag out of the car. "A hotel," he shrugged. "It's a pretty good one. They have great food here. I couldn't take you anywhere else." "Yeah," Emily agreed and asked, "Are we here until tonight?" Stefan grinned enigmatically. "We'll see." They had a wonderful lunch in a half-empty restaurant. The grilled meat was really delicious, fragrant with the smell of the fire. It was delicious. We laughed, talked about nothing and everything. Afterward, she couldn't remember what it was about, no matter how hard she tried. After the meal, Emily thought of her father and texted him, "Don't worry, Dad, I'm fine. I'll write when I get home." She wanted to add something humorous about the hapless guards, but she changed her mind. They're in enough trouble as it is. Why make it worse? "Let's go for a walk." Stefan called out to her when they were already drinking coffee and Emily was sitting pensively on the log veranda of the restaurant, staring at the lazy river. "Let's go," she agreed. "Why do you need a backpack?" she asked, seeing that her companion was putting an impressive bag on his shoulders. "You'll see," he promised her, and the girl did not ask any more questions. They walked for a long time, mostly along the riverbank, only occasionally turning into the woods if the street path was too difficult. Emily didn't whine or complain, but just kept walking and walking after Stefan. It was as if she'd spent her whole life wandering through forests and fields. It was a good thing she always preferred comfortable shoes. Today she was wearing light, weightless sneakers, and her feet didn't feel tired from the long walk. At last they came to a path barely visible in the tall grass on a steep bluff above the river. How beautiful, Emily marveled, folding her palms against the bright midday sun. In the distance, the river plain was silvery as far as the eye could see. Apparently there had been a flood. The lone island in the middle of the river seemed tiny from here, and the vegetation on it looked no bigger than field grass. All around, along with the water, there was an incredible peace. Not a living soul for miles and miles around, just the two of them. The steep sandy cliff, the fragrant meadow grasses, and the delightful river scenery. Emily walked almost to the very edge, stood with her arms spread wide, and tilted her head up into the bright blue sky. Suddenly her foot slipped, rocks sprinkled, and the treacherous cliff led her downward. "Ah," she cried out, but Stefan, quick as lightning, was already clutching her around the waist with his strong arms. "It's all right," he whispered. Whether out of fright or for some other reason, he'd switched to a language Emily didn't recognize. Her heart was beating fast and fast. Her breath caught, and the fear she'd experienced was replaced by something else she'd never felt before, both sweet and slightly repulsive. "What did you say?" She turned to him, their faces almost touching. "What did you say?" she whispered. Stefan didn't answer, but only looked at her with a long, intense stare of his incredible eyes. Their lips met, and Emily felt dizzy, as if she were falling again. Falling from a great height. Her heart froze, her breathing quickened, and the world stopped. Suddenly, Stefan released her from his embrace, and without saying a word to each other, They started down the steep, rocky path to the riverbank. Here, in a tiny cove surrounded on all sides by overhanging limestone cliffs, Stefan set up camp. From his large backpack he took out, in a few minutes set up a tent, a very comfortable tent with a canvas floor, and a mosquito net with a zipper. He inflated a large and firm mattress with a small hand pump, took out 2 light folding chairs and a compact camp barbecue, as well as a bucket of marinated kebabs. "When did you have time to cook all this?" Emily wondered sincerely. Their little bivouac was fully equipped with everything they needed. Even a small tin kettle had been removed from Stefan's oversized backpack. "I always have my backpack with me," her companion flashed a white-toothed smile. "Did you buy kebab at the restaurant?" "No magic." He laughed again, and with that hearty laugh he dispelled Emily's vague suspicions about the whole trip. Together they walked barefoot along the shore, right on the water, because there was no shore on either side, just this tiny little piece of land hidden beneath the shoreline. After walking some distance, splashing water with our feet and laughing merrily, we reached the next strip of land. Here they gathered dry logs, loaded Stefan's empty backpack with them, and went back the same way. Soon there was a small fire crackling under the brazier, just big enough to boil a kettle. Emily was already holding a hot aluminum mug in her hands. "Careful, it's hot," Stefan warned her as he handed her the wonderful-smelling herbal tea. Some herb he had gathered right here. Stefan went upstairs again and fetched a bunch of herbs to show Emily. "Look, it's thyme. This whole meadow smells of it. And this blue one, what kind of herb is it?" the girl asked interestedly. "It's sage," Stefan answered her. "Do you like it?" Yes, Emily twisted the long, lilac blue inflorescences in her fingers and inhaled the tart aroma with pleasure. "It's a woman's herb," Stefan said. "It's harvested at dawn, when the dew is still wet." "And how do you know all this?" Emily marveled for the umpteenth time that day. "It is the tradition of my people," the boy told her gravely. "We all know these things." "What people?" Emily asked cautiously, looking into Stefan's swarthy face. "A nomadic people," Stefan said proudly, looking her in the eye with a questioning look. "Do you know one?" "No," Emily said, confused. "I don't." "Your people call us gypsies," Stefan said calmly. Oh, Emily suddenly perked up. "I know. I've read Danko." Stefan grinned ironically. "It's a fairy tale." "Let it be," Emily agreed. "It may be a fairy tale, but it's beautiful." "Do you like fairy tales?" He looked at her fondly. "You're just a child." "Is that a bad thing?" Emily wondered, preparing to take offense. "No," he smiled again. "How old are you?" 19, Emily said proudly. "I'm old enough." "Too old," Stefan grinned. "Our girls get married at 13 or 14, sometimes at 15, if parents can't find a suitable groom for a long time. If a girl isn't married at 19, it's unlikely she'll ever get married." "I'm not getting married," Emily laughed. "We don't get married that young anymore. What's the point, anyway?" "Think about it before it's too late," he said, shifting his eyebrows pretentiously. "Otherwise I might not be alone." "Oh, you're funny," Emily laughed. "I'll get over it. Don't you want to find love?" "Have kids?" Stefan asked her. "I don't know," Emily shrugged. "I hadn't thought about it yet." "Have you?" she asked him with a quick, sly glance. "Have you found love yet?" "I don't know," Stefan sighed for some reason. Stefan was silent for a while, taking his mug of tea, and Emily thought he was just going to leave her question unanswered. But then he spoke, and what he said shocked her. "I have a fiancée," he told her in his most casual tone, "a fine, well-bred girl, and our parents have approved the union." "Oh," Emily said in a low voice. But she didn't let it show, trying to hold herself together, though there was a storm raging inside her. "I thought I loved her," Stefan continued, "until I met you today." He stared at her with this hypnotic gaze. "Would you believe me if I told you that I knew we'd met?" "How?" She couldn't quite get the words out of her mouth because of the excitement. "My grandmother told me a fortune," the boy answered her seriously. Emily suddenly burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. She literally folded herself in half, sitting on a light wicker chair. "What are you laughing at?" Stefan asked resentfully. "Don't you believe in fortune-telling?" "Actually, I don't even know," Emily said, laughing. "But I'm not laughing because I don't like fortune-telling. It's just that today a friend of mine told me that I would meet my destiny soon." She looked openly at Stefan, and a lot of other things, and I didn't believe her. And now, he looked at her with a long stare and took her small hand in his warm, secure palm. "Do you believe her now?" "I don't know," Emily said softly. "It's all so strange. I just don't understand it yet." "All right," Stefan said, suddenly letting go of her hand and changing his tone. "Let's go swimming." "But I don't have my bathing suit with me." "You don't wear underwear either," Stefan asked calmly. "The difference with a bathing suit is small, in my opinion." "No," Emily frowned. "It's indecent." "Then swim like that. In a t-shirt," he told her. "I have a spare t-shirt with me. I can give it to you. Come on." He went into the tent as Emily sat there, not knowing how to react to this unexpected offer. He returned a little later and came out again in his underwear and a clean t-shirt, tossing it carelessly on an empty chair. He jogged into the water and, running up to his waist, jumped out hard like a large water animal, upward, and then dived, disappearing under the water. He was gone more than a minute, and Emily was beginning to worry when her new acquaintance finally surfaced quite far from where he had entered the river. "Come on," came to her in the surrounding serene silence. "Come on, don't be afraid." After hesitating a little longer, the girl entered the tent, quickly threw off her clothes, put on the offered t-shirt, and stepping carefully along the bank, gingerly entered the cold water. "Come on." "Come on," Stefan called out to her. "You can do it." Emily drew in air, ran through the water, and plunged into it. Like a log, she stepped into what she thought was an icy wave. Her whole body was pierced by 1,000 sharp needles, and she was breathless, but the next moment it felt so wonderful. An incredible vigor came over Emily, and a hot warmth spilled inside. She was filled with an unprecedented energy. She wanted to shout with joy, to swim like a swift dolphin, and to take to the air, diving straight out of the water like a flying fish. But she was unable to do any of these things, and only floundered helplessly, swimming in circles, like an untrained city dog that had been forcibly pushed from the boat into the water. Nearby there were quick strokes of hands on the water, loud laughter, and Stefan swam up to her, wrapped his arms around her torso, and dragged her to the middle of the river. "Where are you going?" Emily was afraid. "What if we drown here?" "No," he laughed. "Don't be afraid, but I am," Emily protested. "There could be these pools." She shuddered at the thought of getting caught in the long, clinging seaweed that would wrap around her body like ropes. But nothing of the sort happened, and in about 10 minutes they were racing each other along the shore of the islet, the same one she was looking at from the cliff to get warm and dry. And after running, they fell, exhausted by bathing, on the soft, silky, dry grass and lay for a long time, looking at the passing clouds. The sky was gradually losing its afternoon depth, and the clouds, fleeing into the distance, lined up in a dull ridge on the horizon, inviting the tired sun to sink into its soft, wind-beaten featherbed. "Look, it'll be dark soon," Emily realized. "Do you want to leave here?" Stefan asked her, looking into her face. "No," she said after a moment's thought, "but I have to. My father will be very worried." "Write to him and tell him you're not coming," Stefan suggested. "You said you were an adult, didn't you?" Emily was silent. Two great desires were fighting desperately: to stay here with Stefan and to experience what she knew would happen if they were alone together in the silence of the night in this small tent. Emily had not yet had such an experience, despite her maturity. On the other hand, she was terribly afraid, and she wanted to be home in her familiar, safe, and beloved little girl's crib. "Let's swim back," Stefan said, getting up. "We have to dry off and get back to the hotel. It would be good if we got to town by 10. Emily got up from the grass, too, and looked at him with warmth and respect, for he hadn't tried to talk her down, despite his obvious desire to be alone with her. "Hold on to me," he told her as they went back into the water. "Swim harder. It's getting colder, or you'll freeze." Emily wrapped her arm around his neck, and they swam side by side like two big fish. On the shore, he quickly pulled a large towel from the tent and rubbed the girl from top to bottom. Then he took out a small and elegant flask. "Drink, or you'll get sick. For God's sake." Emily choked, taking a big gulp. "What in God's name is that?" Emily exclaimed. "Romanian balsam," Stefan grinned. "It's a bitter stuff. Wait, it'll kick in." It didn't take long. In half a minute, Emily felt like molten fire was flowing through her veins instead of blood, and she was so hot from top to toe that she was no longer afraid of the cold. Emily jumped as high as she could and did a strange and fiery dance in the sand. "So what's that?" Stefan laughed as he watched her. "Look, I'll teach you." He raised his hands as if he had placed them in the air, on an invisible support, and began to sway from side to side, describing a semicircle in the sand, carefully stepping in a given rhythm. and at the same time humming louder and louder a charming and incendiary melody. Clap hands changed position, and the movement continued in the other direction, and the semicircle again. "Come on, come here, you can do it," he called out to Emily, who watched him like a mesmerized woman. A step, another step, careful movements, faster, faster. And now the two of them were twirling in a frenzied, rhythmic dance, bouncing and slapping their thighs. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Finally, having finished the dance, Stefan bowed to Emily and, taking her hand, led her to the tent. "Get changed, and let's go." Her cell phone fell out of her jeans pocket, flashing brightly. Her father was calling her, and the display screen showed 23 missed calls and numerous messages. Emily wanted to answer it, but something kept her from taking that step. What would she tell him now? That she was sitting God knows where on the bank of an unfamiliar river with a guy she didn't know, and, frankly, absolutely no intention of going home. The girl went to the message menu, quickly wrote, "Don't wait for me, Daddy, I'll be there tomorrow," and decisively pressed the button to turn off the device. "How are you dressed?" Stefan asked cautiously. Emily put out her hand, grabbed his clothes, and pulled him inside the tent. She pressed her hot lips against his hot mouth behind his neck. He responded to the kiss, but then gently pulled away from her and asked, looking directly into her eyes, "Are you sure?" Yes, Emily nodded, quite sure. Stefan closed the zipper on the entrance, and the two of them were completely cut off from the outside world. It just didn't exist for them anymore. The first rays of the gentle waking sun tickled Emily's eye, and it opened. The first rays of the gentle waking sun tickled Emily's eye, and it opened. The sight before her made her shudder inwardly. She was lying under the blanket next to Stefan, and neither of them had the slightest trace of clothing on. Gradually, she remembered everything that had happened yesterday afternoon, and especially during the night, and blushed thickly. However, she felt neither shame nor any regret. Everything had happened voluntarily. No one had forced her to do it. She had decided to do it herself. Now she was truly an adult and expected to decide her own fate. Stefan woke up to find her sitting by the fire. The kettle was boiling, and the buns from yesterday's stock were warming on the thin branches. "Come," and she smiled at him. "Breakfast is ready." "I see you're a quick learner." He walked over and kissed her. "Good morning." Emily somehow interjected. "What does that mean?" "It means wife." Stefan smiled. "You are now my wife in front of the whole world, and I will not back down from my word." "What do you think husband would be?" Emily asked. "Rum," he answered her gravely. "Then you are my rum," Emily said to him, looking him in the eye, "before the whole world, and I will not go back on my word." "My darling," he put his arm around her. "But it wouldn't be right. You must know everything about me." "Of course I do," Emily nodded. "Do you know about me? I feel that from now on we will be together." At breakfast, they told each other about themselves. Emily was the first to speak. She told a brief history of her not-so-long life, complained about her father's overprotective father. Stefan smiled as he listened to her. "My father is also a wealthy man, but I am poor. Until I get married, my family won't give me any allowance." "Where do you live?" "You said your family is here on business." "Yes," Stefan nodded. "We don't live in this country, and we don't stay in one place for long. But I can't tell you everything yet. You have to meet my family first, and before that I have to go home and reassure my father," she said. "He's very worried there, I'm sure." She laughed nervously. "Let's go." Stefan stood up and started packing his backpack. "I'll drive you." On the way home, Emily felt a wave of anxiety and worry creep up. After all, she was still very dependent on her father and used to obey him in everything. What would happen now? What if he got angry, tried to restrict her freedom? "No," she reassured herself, "I am no longer a child, but an adult, an independent person. Even under the law, no one can make me do anything I don't want to do, not even my own father." When they got almost all the way to Emily's house, she asked Stefan to stop the car around the corner in the alley. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your father?" her boyfriend asked her. "Not today," Emily answered evasively. "I'm afraid he's not in the mood for introductions right now." "Okay, I'll call you." Stefan leaned over and kissed her. See you later, love." And she walked briskly along the alley and didn't turn around once, though she really wanted to. She had warned her father in advance, about half an hour in advance, that she was going home, so that he would not go off on his own to look for her, but would wait for her. Downstairs, the dense guards were puffing. Outwardly, her father was perfectly calm and even smiled dryly at her. "Hi, Daddy," Emily told him, as if nothing had happened, and went up to kiss him. But he pulled away and said, "Don't you want to explain first where you disappeared to and how you escaped from the guards?" "I didn't run away from them," Emily shrugged. "They fell asleep on their own." "What, both of them at once?" Her father laughed incredulously. "Yes," she nodded. I was surprised myself. "Suppose so." He drummed his fingers nervously on the table. "And what did you do, taking advantage of the sudden opportunity?" "I went for a walk," she said calmly. "Shall we have tea?" "Let's talk about this first," said her father firmly. "I want to know where you've been." "I met someone," Emily said. "A very good man. I'm going to marry him." "Dad, I knew it, Dad, I knew it. Who is this man of yours?" "His name is Stefan. His parents are wealthy, so you don't have to worry about me." "Really?" Her father looked at her ironically. "But you've completely reassured me. I know all the decent people in this town. What's his last name?" "I don't know his last name." Emily was confused. "I didn't even ask. Besides, his family isn't from this town. They're here on business." "But that's what business is like." Her father paced back and forth excitedly. "They could be competitors. The ill-wishers put the guards to sleep, took you away, slipped you some bogeyman." "Dad, stop panicking." Emily even laughed. "I met him at uni. No one forced me to go anywhere. Stefan and I just went for a walk in the country." "Did you have a good time?" Dad asked ironically. "Stop it, Dad." Emily blushed. "I'm an adult, and I don't have to answer to you." "Oh, so that's how it is." Dad finally let out the anger he'd been holding back for so long. "So you don't have to. Have you thought about me? Do you realize that I've been going crazy while you've been missing? I wrote to you." Emily fought back. "Isn't that enough? Or did you think you were going to spend the rest of your life looking after me like a little girl?" "Not for the rest of my life," my father argued. "Just until I've arranged your future." "I'll make my own future. I'll make my own future." Emily was screaming too. "And I won't let anyone, not even you, decide for me what it will be like." She turned and went to her room, slammed the door, locked it, fell on the bed and sobbed, as in her distant childhood, when she wanted to walk around the city with her girlfriend. But her father would not let her go. After blowing off steam, she calmed down, took a shower, and went out into the garden with a book and her phone. There was an unread message from Stefan. "How are you, baby?" "Everything." Almost she texted him. "Dad is furious," and added a sad smiley face. She thought about it and added, "Also heart on fire." "Too bad," Stefan wrote back. "When will I see you?" "Let's do it tonight at 6 o'clock in a cafeteria near the university. You know Donner?" "Uh-huh. See you then." "I'm waiting. Heart on fire, too." Emily smiled and turned off her phone. She tried to pick up the book, but she couldn't read anything. The lines were jumping in front of her eyes, and the meaning of what she was reading was slipping away. Then she took the smartphone again and read all the messages from the girls, of which 500 had accumulated since yesterday. Nothing special, just a lot of gossip. The only one that caught her eye was from Penelope, who asked how things were going with the young king and whether she believed in yesterday's fortune-telling. "All is well," Emily wrote to her. "The king is on top of things," and she added a funny face with kisses, and then another, "Your cards were right." And Penelope answered her with some cheerful nonsense too. But then Emily wondered if it was true that Stefan had come into her life too quickly after that stupid tarot card reading. Coincidence? But it had said something about a fiery passion, and the cards had been right about that. Emily remembered the night in the tent and smiled to herself. Stefan had said something about his grandmother's fortune-telling, too. She'd have to ask him about it. "Where are you going again?" When her father saw that his daughter was about to leave the house, he came out and stood in the doorway. Hand in hand to the cafe with the girls, Emily mumbled to him. "You'll be gone all night again." Her father was clearly in no mood to let her go. "I don't think I'm going to," Emily told him gruffly. "Let me go." "You need to learn how to speak politely first." He didn't even think about moving away. "Did you really think I'd let you go anywhere after last night? What's this about running away to the castle?" Emily was furious. "What am I? A thing to be disposed of? I wouldn't dream of it." "Let me go." I said, "Let me through." "Look at her," she said. Her father smirked and still didn't move. "All right," Emily said threateningly, and turned and went to her room. She dialed Stefan and asked him to come to the house on the side of the alley. She'd had an opening made in the fence there a long time ago, just in case. At the bottom, one of the bars of the fence was movable so that it could be moved to the side and climbed it through. No one knew about it because it was behind the ivy-covered netting where Emily liked to sit, reading or texting with the girls. 15 minutes later, she climbed out her bedroom window and was soon on the loose. Stefan's car, wheels rustling softly, drove away from the house, taking her with it. "I hate him," she said to Stefan in her heart, sitting down in the seat and fastening her seatbelt. "Don't talk about your father like that." He stopped her with a gesture of his hand. "It's too bad, but he treats me like his property." "It's understandable, because he wants to protect you," Stefan said judiciously. "Listen to you, I shouldn't have left right now," Emily said wryly. "Feelings are stronger than we are," he sighed. "Besides, it's fate, and you can't argue with fate." "Listen, Stefan, tell me about what your grandmother did," Emily asked. "Do you really want to know?" "Do you?" "Of course I do. It's so interesting." "Okay," he nodded. "I'll tell you when we get there," Stefan said. It wasn't easy to get a free table at this hour, but Stefan managed to get one, and in the most secluded corner, away from prying eyes. "My grandmother," he began as they placed their order. "She's an oracle, so she can really tell the future," Emily marveled. "Yes," Stefan nodded, "she can do that and more. A few years ago, when I was very young, she played a big solitaire game to find out my fate. The first time she did it was when I was born, and she never did it again until I was made a man of the family." "How so?" Emily wondered. "It's a complicated ceremony," Stefan grumbled. "You'll find out someday. Not the point. In short, when a boy reaches the age of 16, he is declared an adult, a real man, in front of the whole family. That's the day Grandma laid out her circular solitaire. That's what she calls it. Then she told my mother and father that my future wife lives in a far northern country, and though not called Ramallah, our blood runs in her veins. So it's definitely not me," Emily laughed sadly. "Or was your grandmother mistaken? There is no gypsy blood in my veins." "Are you sure?" "Emily, to what need do you know your ancestors? At least to the 5th. "Do you?" "To the 5th. The girl was confused. "It's like 5 generations back in time," Stefan explained. "Your father and mother are second to you, your grandparents are third, and so on." "I don't even know both my grandmothers," Emily said sadly. "My mother died in childbirth, and my father never told me about her parents, and his own mother, my grandmother, took care of me when I was tiny. Then she died, and my grandfather died even earlier. That's all. A few pictures in a scrapbook. I don't even remember their names." "Is there such a thing?" Stefan splashed his hands. "What do you mean you don't know your own grandparents?" "That's how it is," Emily said, embarrassed. "What can I do? And look, I don't look like a gypsy at all." "There are redheads among the Ramallahs," answered Stefan. "They have the hottest fire in their blood. My grandmother was a fiery redhead when she was young." "Really?" Emily was surprised. "I thought you were all dark." "No," Stefan laughed. "That's just stereotyping. It's like saying that Americans are all blonde and that cowboys walk the streets in America." "But you never told me where you live," Emily reminded him. "I know gypsies are nomads, but you're not always traveling." "Your knowledge of my people comes entirely from books," Stefan laughed again. "Besides, we Ramallahs are so different. Nomadic Ramallahs are the lowest caste, so to speak. My family is at the top of the hierarchy. Our family has lived in Romania for many centuries. I am a citizen of that country." "Wow," Emily marveled. "Isn't Romania where Count Drew Clon's castle is?" "Stereotypes again," Stefan rolled his eyes. "Yes, Count D once lived on the territory of modern Romania, but he was definitely not a vampire, just a harsh ruler. If anything, I'm not a vampire either," and he held up his hands playfully. "I'm already convinced of that," Emily laughed. "You had the perfect opportunity to drink my blood, and if you didn't take it, you're not a vampire." They sat in the cafe for a long time, talking about this and that, and at the end of the evening they went for a walk along the promenade and agreed that tomorrow they would go to meet Stefan's relatives. "They all want to see you very much," her lover told her goodbye. The day after the university, he picked up Emily in his luxury car, and this time Daddy's guards did not fail. All the way drove behind them a little further away. "Oh, my darlings, what do I see? Come in quickly. Oh, my dear, what a beauty your chosen one is. Children, let me look at you properly. My dear, welcome to the family. You're a beauty, real, bright, like my mother." Dumbfounded by such a warm welcome, Emily stood smiling stupidly as compliments, smiles, warm hugs, and compliments poured in from all sides. She thought it would only be Stefan's parents, but there were so many people here, and all so friendly, as if she were a relative they all hadn't seen in a while. Without letting her realize it, they were singing, standing in a lively circle, clapping their hands, and in the center of it were she and Stefan and two others, a man and a woman. The man played the guitar, and the woman danced beautifully and fiercely. Emily's feet wanted to dance. Stefan noticed it and invited her to dance, showing her which moves to repeat. The girl caught on, and in a couple of minutes she was dancing with all the gypsies as if she had been doing it all her life. Those standing in the circle also joined in the dance, and the fun continued. They played again and again, danced and sang. Finally, the music died down and everyone was invited to the table. "You are good," Stefan praised her in a whisper. "Your parents liked the way you danced." "Which of them are your parents?" Emily asked quietly. "Now you'll understand," promised the guy. And indeed, when everyone poured ruby tart wine into glasses, a strong black-haired man in a fine suit from Armani and an incredibly beautiful woman stood up from the table. Emily had never seen such an expressive face in her life. The two men made a speech. "Today we present to everyone the bride of our eldest son. You have all just had the opportunity to appreciate her undeniable beauty and grace." At these words, Emily was embarrassed and tilted her head, and the future father-in-law continued. "Besides, this union is predetermined by a great destiny, and my honorable mother predicted it long before today's happy day. Let us drink to the health of the young ones. May their hearts be blessed." Everyone raised their glasses and drank to the proposed toast. Then Stephen's mother took the floor. "My dear daughter-in-law, I have 4 sons and only 1 daughter. With your arrival in our family, I will have 2 daughters, and I am very happy. You are beautiful and intelligent. It is immediately obvious. My son has made his choice, and I am proud of him and you, my daughter. Soon we will give you a lavish and rich wedding, which will be the envy of Queen Lune herself. I look forward to adding to our large family, where we welcome you today with great love." The woman approached Emily, smiled gently at her, and hugged her. Emily had tears in her eyes, for she had grown up without a mother and had never known a woman's affection. And her father never had any friends or relatives in the house at all. "It's like living in a prison," she thought to herself. But here were so many friendly people, genuinely happy for her and Stefan. They were all so cheerful, so nice, and seemed to be completely different from the stereotypical ideas that other people have zit. They were all beautifully dressed. The women had marvelous figures. Their makeup was impeccable. And the mansion that the large family had rented here, Stefan informed her, was also a model of excellent style. No dirt or motley rags. There was nothing of the sort. "Do we have to say something too?" Emily asked Stefan quietly as everyone settled back into their seats. Later he smiled at her. "I'll answer at the end, and then you, if you want to." But that wasn't all the surprises of tonight that awaited Emily a few minutes later. 2 beautiful boxes were brought into the great hall where everyone was sitting. One, the small one, Stefan's father solemnly handed to Emily, and the larger one was opened in front of her by his mother. "This is for you, dear, to wear at the wedding," she said. Emily was breathless with excitement. The big flat box contained a gorgeous tiara studded with diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires, and earrings to go with it. And in the small box was a marvelous ring with a beautiful but unfamiliar stone in the middle. It was the color of coffee and milk and beautifully cut. It was a topaz, a birthstone. "My mother Shumana told me to give it to you," the father-in-law told Emily, and even bowed slightly to her. "She didn't come with us. She's too old. But she said that in time my child will take her place." Emily was confused and immediately remembered the end of the fortune-telling tape. "You will become a priestess," was what she had said. "Accept our thanks." Stefan came to her rescue. "Bow," he said in Emily's ear. She obeyed and put the ring on her middle finger. "Now it's my turn to give my beloved a gift," Stefan said solemnly, and knelt down on one knee and handed Emily another box. This one contained an emerald ring studded with small diamonds. Next was dinner, lots of different foods, lots of drinks. Then there was dancing again, and at the end of the evening the young people made a return speech. Emily followed her fiancé with warm and full of gratitude words. They were applauded for a long time. The wedding was scheduled for August, and until then the young people had to lead a nomadic life, to prove to the clan that they were true Ramalas. That was their tradition, Stefan had explained to her beforehand. At the end of their journey they were to arrive at the king's huge castle. "Our ruler will receive you like all his other children and bless you. The relatives of the departing young men gave them a farewell greeting. A return visit to Emily's father was also arranged. Emily, of course, was skeptical about this possibility. She was sure that her father would refuse and make a huge scandal when he found out about everything. Of course, she was not mistaken. "Good morning, Papa," she said to her father the next morning. "I have some news for you." "What news?" her father mumbled, taking his eyes off the television. "I'm getting married." Emily exhaled and looked at her father with determination. He stood up from his seat. Her father's face contorted in shock. "Who are you going to marry?" "That jerk. He's got nothing behind him." "Dad, you know what kind of car he drives," Emily rebuked him. "Your surveillance told you everything." "Don't be so," she couldn't find the right word. "Stefan has a very wealthy family. They're all so nice, so kind." "Now how do you know?" Dad was devastated. "Did they tell you themselves?" Yes, the daughter nodded. Look, she held out her hands on which both rings were displayed. "Stolen or fake," the father said without even looking. "And the car must be stolen too. Will you ask people to check the database tomorrow? It has Romanian license plates." Emily said mockingly. "I don't think you can check that." "What are you going to Romania?" My father's jaw dropped. "Who are they all?" "Romanian gypsies," the daughter replied calmly. And that was the last straw. The father yelled incessantly, threw dishes, broke his own favorite statue hound dogs, promised to lock Emily in the house until she came to her senses. "You can't hold me," she told him. "I'm going with him anyway. It's my destiny." "You know what the hell fate is," Dad yelled over and over again. "They're just bewitching you. I'll find a way to deal with them. You know that. In the meantime, go to your room and stay there." "I thought much better of you," Emily shook her head. "This is useless." "Dad, we're already man and wife." For his information, she didn't listen to what he was yelling and went back to her room. Emily had packed her bag with her belongings in advance, and now all she had to do was find a way to break out of her home prison. It wasn't going to be easy. Her father had guards posted everywhere. There were 2 sitting directly across from her room, 2 more in the hall, 2 more downstairs. At the gate at the exit, there was a group of guards, as usual, and a couple at the back. That's not much to go on. "Stefan, he locked me," and Emily texted her fiancé. "There are guards everywhere. What am I supposed to do?" "Come get me out of here." "I'll be there in an hour. But before I arrive, you must say the special words 3 times," Stefan wrote back to her. "I'll send them to you in a voicemail right now. Practice and repeat them exactly as I say them. If you do it right, everyone around you will fall asleep, and we can leave without any trouble. And if not," Emily thought, "if I can't or if I do something wrong, what then?" She tried to push those dark thoughts away from her and began repeating over and over the words that came in the voicemail. She looked out into the lobby, the guards still sitting around the TV. Emily defiantly walked past them to see their reaction. It was business as usual. No one had fallen asleep. Returning to the room with the bottle of Coke she'd supposedly gone out to get, she began practicing again and finally felt like she was getting it exactly right. After repeating it 3 times, she looked out into the hallway again, cautiously stepping closer to the guards. Oh, miracle. Both were sound asleep. Grabbing her bag, Emily slipped past the similarly sleeping ones at the front door and with a wince pulled back the heavy deadbolt on the door at the gate. No one woke up, came out, stopped her. There was Stefan's car. "Get in, my love. Now we will never be separated from you again," he kissed her, and they drove away. When Emily's father didn't find his daughter anywhere after a while, he didn't yell at the guards or get angry, but just sank down on the bed, covered his face with his hands, and spoke softly. "Damn it." So it had happened after all. And, pulling out a picture of a smiling red-haired woman who looked a lot like Emily, he said to her, "You were right, Sarah." The young people settled down in one of the rooms of the huge mansion, where Emily had already been when she met Stefan's relatives. "Rest while you can," one of the aunts told them jokingly, and left, shutting the door behind her. "What does she mean by that?" Emily asked the groom. "So we'll be on our way soon. All on our way, my love. There's me, you, and a few others of ours. By August, we should be home across Europe," Stefan said excitedly. "That's great," Emily exclaimed. "No, we're not going in a car," Stefan stopped her enthusiasm gently. "What will we drive?" she asked carelessly. Briggy smiled. "An ordinary carriage." "You mean?" She was digesting the news in amazement. "That we're going on horseback." "Yes," Stefan nodded. "Do you know how to ride a horse?" "Yes," Emily said. "I studied horseback riding for several years." "That's good. Now you have to learn the art of riding in a carriage," he laughed. 2 weeks later, Stefan, Emily and a few other relatives loaded some things into a wagon pulled by 2 horses, bought the necessary food, and set off. The rest of the gypsies left by some other, more civilized route. Emily was excited about the unusual journey ahead, traveling like true nomads, sleeping wherever they could under the moon and stars. What could be better? It was as if some dormant instinct had awakened in her, and with her soul wide open and her eyes wide open, she gave herself completely to her new passion. Needless to say, she was not sorry to leave her hometown, university friends, in general, everything she knew and loved. It was only at the thought of her father that her heart clenched tightly, but Emily simply couldn't do otherwise. She knew it was her destiny, and you can't argue with destiny. It would take a little more than 2.5 weeks to reach their destination with the transportation they now had. But both men and horses need rest and food, so they expected to get there in a month, perhaps a month and a half. There were various contingencies, too, and they happened on the way. Once a cinch broke and had to be repaired, another time a wheel bent. The wagon needed repairs, too. Besides, they tried to go far away from noisy highways, so as not to frighten the horses, and not to breathe smoke and fumes, and not to become an object of increased attention of travelers' car drivers. "I don't think my friends would recognize me now," Emily laughed, sitting on the seat and holding the reins. She wore a mottled patchwork skirt, a loose-fitting white shirt, and a bright crimson silk vest. Her hair was tied up in the same crimson handkerchief. Those silk handkerchiefs were not practical, as she had already had occasion to see. They slip out of her hair no matter how you tie them. "You're a real Romy now," my Romano Stefan smiled affectionately at her, who was also dressed, as nomadic gypsies should be, in loose pants of plain cloth, an embroidered vest, and a simple shirt of his own. "Have you any regrets?" "No," Emily answered him with a pure heart, "not at all." But at night, especially in the morning hours, when the line between the worlds is so thin, Emily often woke up and felt a longing for her father and an oppressive sense of anxiety for him. When she left, she wrote him a few messages, asking him not to judge her harshly. She said that she had gone to Romania. She didn't specify how, and expressed hope that her father would someday change his mind and come to visit her in her new home. "When we get settled, I'll write you my new address," Emily reported. She never received a reply to either message. On the road, which the girl enjoyed so much, she became very close to her new tribesmen, of whom there were 6 others traveling with them. During the day, they took turns driving the brig, singing a chorus of different gypsy songs, and, by all accounts, Emily was the best at it. The women taught her intricate national embroidery, the art of gypsy cooking, and even the infamous fortune-telling. Emily laughed until tears, feeling no more or less than Cassandra, and she wrote to Penelope and the other girls she still kept in touch with that she was going to be a real fortune-teller. The cards were called something else, not tarot, but the pictures were something similar, and soon Emily had quite mastered the complex solitaire and layouts. One day the female relative said to her, "But now you're a real fortune-teller. Go make us some money." "How?" Emily marveled. "You see, at the gas station nearby, cars stop, people come out to rest, go to them and offer to tell fortunes." "Why," Emily was surprised again, "don't we have anything to eat?" "Yes, honey. We're running low on food." The women made sorrowful faces. "But go." Emily turned helplessly to Stefan, but he only shrugged and smiled in solidarity with the tribesmen. There was nothing to do, so they had to go. "Good people, come here, I'll guess your fate," Emily began in a monotonous voice. "I've heard her new kin do it 100 times, for luck, for love. Who needs to know what awaits him in the future? Come here, it's cheap, I'll open it for you. It's all right in the palm of your hand." She was so into her role that she approached the expensive foreign car without shyness and leaned over, looking through the open window. "Do you want a fortune, beautiful?" "Come on." "Only quickly, before her husband comes back," said the woman sitting in the front seat. "Give me a pen, dear, and silver the coin." Emily smiled at this poor prisoner of progress and felt in her gut how unhappy she was. "And dear," Emily quickly slipped into her pocket a $1,000 bill, which the woman gave her. "You live badly and you don't love your husband." "I should love him." The woman sighed heavily. "Such a womanizer. Damn him. Is there no remedy to make him stop going to women?" "Leave him yourself, my beauty," Emily told her quickly, "and then fate will turn to you on the bright side." "Ah," the woman asked pitifully. "He has money, and I have nothing, not even an education." "You should get an education with his money," Emily advised her, "and don't tell him. He won't be interested." "Really?" "Get a job, get yourself a job, get a lawyer, after all, and then you can go away and be free." "Oh, honey, good luck to you." "How beautifully you guess," admired the woman. "No one has ever said such a thing." Wait, she rummaged in her purse and pulled out another 5,000. "Here you go. Thanks for the advice." "You're welcome." Emily was slightly taken aback by her accomplishment. She quickly stepped away from the car, seeing a man coming out of the gas station pavilion, eyeing the car with a sharp eye. "Here," she said proudly as she walked back across the highway to her own. "Take that," Stefan shouted the women, laughing. "Your young one will soon have us all under her belt." "What, are you sure you're not a gypsy, my dear?" they asked Emily, laughing for the umpteenth time. "I am," she said, smiling at them. "It's just my destiny to be associated with gypsies." At Polish customs, they were held up all day, asking for documents they didn't have. In the end, they gave up, tired of the gypsies, who had already managed to get around everything and everyone during their forced stay. Emily had a passport, but Stefan had told her not to even show it to her. Gypsies don't carry any documents with them when they travel on their own. It's a tradition. "We are a free people," Stefan told her. "We don't need any silly papers." At the Romanian border, however, he did show some kind of document. Emily noticed that, and also noticed how the customs officers changed their faces. They almost had a look on their faces. "Did you show them something like that?" she asked. "It doesn't matter. I told you we don't need any silly papers." "It's different here," Stefan smiled. "We've come home now, and I need my document." They drove through Romania in a very merry way. The weather was beautiful. The people around them were very friendly. Almost every second smiled and waved at them. The peasants in the small villages were bringing all kinds of food to the road, and here they no longer earned money by fortune-telling. "So it's as if every dog knows you here," laughed Emily. "They do," answered her tribesmen. "Now we are home, in our native land." The local beauty, rocky mountains, fertile plains, ancient castles, and less often picturesque ruins delighted Emily. "How beautiful," she marveled, looking around. "This is the most beautiful country I have ever been in." "It's your home country now, too," Stefan told her affectionately. "We'll be there soon. By tonight, I think." It was getting dark when the tall and austere castle appeared right in front of them, as if sealing the narrow mountain road. It seemed so ancient, as if it had grown out of the rock on which it stood. It was true that its walls were not much different in color from the rock, but how beautiful it was. "What is this castle?" Emily asked her fiancé. "It's Vogel," Stefan answered. "Our home." "This is your home?" Emily was stunned. She had not expected her fiancé to be the heir to such splendor. "Our house," Stefan repeated, "not just mine, our family's, and yours now, too." "Vogel," Emily repeated thoughtfully. "What does that mean?" "An unbreakable shelter," answered Stefan proudly. "It has stood on this land for 1,000 and 1,500 years, and it will stand for as long, and perhaps more, as long as there is even one small member of our family alive." They entered the castle courtyard after dark. They were out of sight on the steep mountain road, and Emily's heart was racing. It seemed to her that they were about to fall into the abyss. But the family knew their business, and the horses, driven by skillful charioteers, pulled the wagon up the hill. And at the castle they were met by their relatives, who crowded into the wide cobbled courtyard. "They are our young ones." Stefan and Emily arrived. They were grabbed from all sides, lifted in their arms, put wreaths of fragrant flowers and some incredible leaves around their necks, and literally carried in their arms inside. Thousands of candles burned in the huge hall. The long tables of roughly hewn wood seemed as old as the castle itself. The 4 tall windows stretched 6 meters below the ceiling, which was completely invisible in the semi-darkness. Emily even thought she detected some swift movement up there, someone's quick shadows gliding in the darkness. "What is it?" she whispered to Stefan. "I'm scared." "They're bats," he laughed. "They've always lived here, as long as I can remember." The feast lasted until dawn, and then the young couple was ceremoniously ushered into the huge, lavishly furnished bedroom. Emily liked that her folks had no prejudices about a formal wedding. She didn't even know if it was customary to register a state marriage here. She didn't really care. But she had been wondering about something else for weeks, and she had been afraid to tell Stefan. But now that she was under a real roof and in a real bed, she suddenly made up her mind. "Darling, there's something I want to tell you. I don't know how you're going to take it." "What is it?" He was sitting on the edge of the bed taking off his boots, but he turned to her and looked at her. "Yes or no?" "Anyway, I'm pregnant," she blurted out and froze, not knowing how he would take it. Stefan remained silent and looked at her with a strange expression. Then she couldn't stand it any longer and spoke quickly. "I guess we'd better not talk about all this for a while, wouldn't we? I don't think it's a good idea to give such news before the wedding. How will your family take it?" What if they don't like it? Emily, Stefan interrupted her. Stop, please. Stop what? She asked, almost crying. You have no idea what a gift you've given me. He jumped out of bed in one boot, lifted her in his arms and spun her around the room, shouting with delight. I'm going to be a father soon. We'll announce at the wedding. That's wonderful, Emily. Let go, she fought back, laughing. Let me go. Later, her mother-in-law, whom Stefan had told, quietly explained to her that a bride's pregnancy before the wedding was a very good sign. It means that the marriage will definitely bear its due fruit. And the big family will not run dry. It won't run dry. You've been sent to us by fate, she hugged Emily. There's someone else you need to meet today. By the evening of the next day, rested and dressed, Emily was taken to a small house, standing alone in the castle grounds. There was a knock on the door. Emily saw a very old woman, gray as a moon, with long silver hair partially braided into thin braids, sitting in front of a hearth burning in broad daylight, smoking a large pipe. All the walls and even the ceiling of the room where the hearth was burning were hung with bundles of dried herbs, carcasses and skins of killed animals ranging from hares to lizards and bats. Something was boiling in a cauldron on the fire, and above it on the stove stood a large copper kettle, polished to a mirror shine. Two young women sat at the old woman's feet. One was sewing something with a big, thick needle, and the other was rubbing a smelly brown ointment on her feet. Sit down. The old woman looked at Emily and pointed to the bench beside her and nodded to the couch behind her. Emily timidly sat down. The old woman put her hand on her head and closed her faded eyes. Then she began rocking back and forth and humming something monotonously. This went on for a long time. Emily was about to fall asleep when suddenly the old woman took her dry, wrinkled palm away from her head and clapped her hands together, saying something loudly. Emily's language was incomprehensible, and she was surprised, for she had learned Romance quite well during the few weeks of travel. You are one of us now, the old woman said in a familiar dialect. When you give birth, you will come to me. I'll teach you. Thank you. But what about you? Said Emily, wondering when she had already told this old woman that she was pregnant. Are you wearing my ring? The old woman asked in a creaky voice. Yes, Emily showed her her right hand. Are you Stefan's grandmother? She exclaimed. The old woman smiled, showing yellow, pointed teeth. And yours, too. Of course, it's mine now. Emily took her hand and kissed it as a sign of respect and submission to the older woman. Good girl, the old woman stroked her head. Come, daughter. Emily realized that she had called her daughter. She felt a warmth in her heart. The wedding took place a few days after their arrival. It was truly a grand celebration. For a whole week, the guests had been celebrating. So many people came. It seemed that the huge castle couldn't hold them all, but somehow they did. On the first day, a symbolic bargaining session was held. Emily sat, covered with a translucent veil, and the relatives bargained for her with themselves. In the absence of the bride's parents that day, her future father-in-law invited her to the ceremony and an elaborate dance. On another day, young unmarried girls came in and began dressing and combing Emily's hair. The gorgeous dress was not white, as Emily thought, but a delicate lilac with bright scarlet patterns. The girl's long red hair was loose and partially braided into fine braids, which were placed on her head in the form of a hoop, and then put on top of the family tiara, a gift from her future mother-in-law. Dressed like a princess, Emily was led with songs downstairs to the great hall. Here Stefan was already waiting for her, also richly dressed, and also with a crown on his head. What surprised Emily was that Stefan's father also had a crown on his head. How many crowns do they have? Emily thought to herself. Her father took their hands and made quick cuts on their ring fingers with a sharp knife. Then he joined their hands together to mix the blood. You are now man and wife forever, he proclaimed. My heirs are the next king and queen of our family. May it never fade away. Emily was literally numb with amazement. So her husband was the heir to the royal family of Ramallah. So that's why their carriage was greeted by the locals with rapturous shouts. Let me introduce you to my wife, the future Queen, Stefan said loudly, taking the young wife's hand. She is expecting my heir. The general murmur and shouts that rose at these words of Stephen drowned out even the loud music that was being played by a live orchestra somewhere at the very vault of the castle ceiling. Long live the king. Hail, shouted everyone. Hooray for the heir. May your union be blessed. The wine flowed, and the tables were filled with food for days to come. In the end, Emily was so tired that she collapsed on the bed and told her husband that she intended to stay that way for a week. Lie down and rest, he smiled. You deserve it. Now Emily's life was truly royal. She was served by several young girls who fulfilled her every whim. Everyone in the castle was at her service, except for her husband's parents, the king and queen of Ramallah. Even they constantly came to visit her chambers, bringing generous gifts and inquiring about the health of her dear daughter-in-law and the future baby. For the wedding, her young husband gave her the same beam as the one he drove in America when they met, only in the color of sea waves. And father-in-law and mother-in-law gave the young couple a luxurious villa in the center of New York, where Stefan and Emily spent many unforgettable days walking around the capital, dining in the most luxurious restaurants and thinking up a name for their boy. "It will be a boy," Emily said confidently, placing her husband's hand on her belly. "Can you feel it pushing? Like a real man." Happy Stefan gently kissed his wife's rounded tummy. "My son, I can't wait to see you." At the end of March, the young Ramallah couple gave birth to a healthy son. The occasion was once again celebrated with a big party, and Emily was again showered with gifts. A year later, they had a second son, and the young woman plunged headlong into the care of their beloved babies. Time flowed imperceptibly, and now they celebrated their third wedding anniversary, and Emily felt pregnant again. Everything went on as usual. One day, their routine was interrupted by an event that Emily noticed only a few days later, when she found her old smartphone with an American SIM card in her desk drawer. She turned it on and topped up the balance. Immediately, a bunch of messages arrived, and among them was one from her father. He wrote that he missed her very much and asked when he could visit his daughter. Emily dialed his number immediately and listened to the long beeps with excitement. Finally, he answered. "Daddy," she said in a trembling voice. "It's me, Emily, my daughter." He was obviously pleased, but his voice was strained and unhappy. "I never thought I'd hear from you." "It's okay, Dad, come visit." "Yeah, I'd like to come visit." "Write down your address." "I wrote you a long time ago, but I'll do it again." "Of course, come and see the grandchildren." She thought she heard him sobbing. "I'll get the tickets tomorrow." "Good. We'll meet you at the airport." 2 days later, she and Stefan met her father in Washington. At the sight of Emily and Stefan's lavishly dressed and chauffeured Cadillac, his father was clearly amazed, but he didn't let on. They'd come to the villa first so he could rest before their trip to the mountains. "Come in, Dad, make yourself at home," Emily told him. "Where are my grandchildren?" Father turned his head, looking at the immaculate furnishings of the villa. "They are at home on the estate in the mountains," they explained to him. "This is where we live when we come to Washington." The castle had blown my father away, and when the king and queen of Ramallah met him in full dress for a gala dinner, he was numb for a few seconds. "Emily, this is," when he found himself in her private apartments, he looked around, unable to find the right words, and all this time I thought, like a fool, that I had you poor somewhere in the world. "You what?" Emily laughed. "Though we did come here as simple nomads. Ramallah's intense, can you imagine? It was a kind of test, a tradition before the wedding. It was explained to me later, not to forget my roots. But I already knew Stefan's family was wealthy. I told you, remember?" "I remember," my father admitted guiltily. "I have something to tell you, my daughter," he added, and pulled a picture of a young red-haired woman out of the breast pocket of his jacket. "Is that your mom?" Emily asked. "I have one just like it," and she showed her own in a beautiful frame standing on the dresser. "Yes, of course it is. But you don't know her story. I kept it from you for a long time, my daughter. Your mother was a gypsy." Ramallah Emily automatically corrected herself and then exclaimed, "What? Yes." Her father nodded. "She was born in a nomadic Tabor, but she was orphaned at the age of 10. I met her by chance and immediately fell in love. It was like a lightning strike." "I felt the same way when I met Stefan," Emily whispered through her tears. "We didn't live together long," he continued. "You were born soon afterward, and she died the same day." Michael wiped away the tears with his handkerchief. "But before she died, she told me, our daughter will meet her destiny and return to the Tabor. I know it. Don't keep her," and I swore an oath, and I broke my oath. How am I to blame?" He dropped his head into his palms and sobbed. "Don't, Papa." Emily gently stroked her father's shoulders. "It's all right now. You can't escape fate. Do you see that now?" "I didn't want you to live in poverty," he said, barely able to speak. "I was so afraid of losing you forever, like your mother. We're together now." Emily hugged him and kissed his cheek. "Live here with us. Sell everything there. Buy yourself an apartment in Washington or a house here, whatever you want. You'll see your grandchildren. And soon you'll have a granddaughter," Emily proudly announced. "Isn't that a blessing?" Yes, yes, her father cheered. You're quite right, dear. It is true happiness. I think I shall do it. Of course, it would be the right thing to do. Then my Sarah will forgive me, wherever she is now. A couple of years later, a visiting traveler would have seen such a picture in the vicinity of an old castle. An elderly gray-haired man walked day after day across the picturesque, meadow grass-covered plateaus, with 3 grandchildren. 2 dark-haired boys and a small nimble girl with hair the color of white chestnut ran around like eels around. The grandfather, sitting in his chair, watched them carefully and from time to time pulled them down when they were very naughty. Sarah Midnight stopped bullying the boys. Let's get ready. It's lunchtime for all of us, he said. And they went up the winding mountain path to the foot of the ancient castle, which seemed to grow out of the rock, safeguarding one big and friendly family. For several hundred long years they all had the same destiny, both the castle and the people living in it. And as you know, you can't argue with fate. The mother-in-law kicked the village orphan daughter-in-law out the door, and after a while of seeing her, numbers were crucial in Nayli's life. And could it be otherwise with more than 40 years of accounting experience? Immediately after the institute, she was assigned to a food processing plant, where she worked faithfully for more than 10 years, until the collapse of the union. The combine was drowning in debts, and by the mid-90s finally collapsed. While others ran in panic about tomorrow, Nayli, then still Nayli, quickly realized who takes control of the market and through old connections got a job in a construction company, which was run by brothers. Nayli faithfully kept the books, often received good gifts from the bosses for labor in the form of cognac and expensive foreign candy. Nayli was not ashamed to participate in the dubious affairs of the owners of the company, then secured a spacious 2-room apartment in the center of the city for nothing. Own figures never let her down. She could rely on them and only on them. The dashing 90s were replaced by the new millennium. Gradually, loopholes and holes in the laws and taxation system became less and less. It was no longer possible to pull off the old schemes, and the legitimacy of her employer's business was becoming more and more suspicious. Nayli prudently quit her job when she realized that she smelled a stink and went to work in the university accounting department. The pay there, of course, was more modest, but it was peaceful. Yes, and take a remote maintenance of document management of some small entrepreneurs. No one forbade her. Secretly, of course. The main thing was that the numbers were happy again. Soon Nayli turned into Nayli Smith. She was respected by her colleagues for her acumen, experience, and impeccable professionalism. She was also feared by the students, where Nina Ivanovna taught economics and other specialized disciplines, having quickly received a correspondence pedagogical education. Figures pleased, led her through life, and never once failed. Only in one thing the figures did not help. Nina Ivanovna had no personal life by the age of 60. True, there was a joyous son, Matthew. The woman met his father while she was working for the brothers. It was a visitor from the village, a handsome guy, with a rich imagination, who misled her. A pretty accountant. When Nayli suspected that he was interested in her apartment, specifically the propiska in it, she noisily kicked the suitor out and found out she was pregnant the same week. From a small age, Matthew she brought up disciplined, collected, and responsible. The boy at the age of 4 could fry eggs, never cried or complained. He graduated from school with a silver medal. Nayli dreamed that her son received a higher education, and therefore saved money for it almost from his first grade. And when he passed on the budget, and even at the law school, the woman could not rejoice. Money in one piece, and her son will be a lawyer, as she wanted. Since Matthew's birth, Nayli has never had another serious relationship. She'd had affairs, of course, but it was always numbers that interfered. The beau didn't earn enough. What kind of a man was he who earned less than she did? It's a shame to go out in public with such a man. He wasn't tall enough, or too old, or too young. And constantly it seemed to Nayli that all the gentlemen are trying to steal her living space, gained even if not quite honest, but painstaking labor. In the big city, there are many who want to settle down without much worry at someone else's expense. Nayli was determined not to be that expense. All she cared about were the numbers, the welfare of herself and her son. That evening, Nayli waited for her son to come to dinner, somehow nervously. First she broke a cup, then she scattered salt on the table. The woman was not a superstitious woman, but the resulting mess irritated her. Matthew had shown up at 9 o'clock, cheerful and overjoyed, a vivid expression of emotion he didn't often display. and Nayli didn't welcome such extravaganzas from experience. She knew they usually had 3 reasons, and there were rarely good ones in love, drunk, or an idea that required money. The first had been settled long ago. Matthew was indifferent to that. He wasn't partial to the second one either, so. "Well, tell me what you've already thought up," Nayli asked, looking at her offspring from head to toe through her thin glasses. "What have you thought of, Mom?" Matthew tried to hide his enthusiasm, but it didn't work very well. He was literally bursting with bright colors. "I can't see it," the woman shook her head. Matthew hesitated and sat down on a stool at the table. He knew that, as usual, his mother rejected all his ideas. She thought she knew what was best for her son. No, Matthew was grateful for her sensitivity, but he had never tried to follow her instructions completely. When she forbade him to get a dog as a child, the enterprising Matthew disappeared to the house of his friend Andrew. He did not like his German shepherd Palma, and with the dog Matthew quickly got used to it, even walked with it, gladly replacing the lazy companion. After such walks of her son, Nayli wrinkled her nose, not understanding why suddenly the apartment smelled of dog. In high school, Matthew dreamed of playing the guitar, but Nayli said that the guitar was the domain of idlers. Look at Vysotsky. How much did he accomplish? Mother was wringing her hands in front of her son. But Vysotsky is a legendary man, 16-year-old Matthew parried. A good legend, a circus performer. Nayli spent her life in theaters with her guitar and eventually died at 42. You know why? You should lead a normal life, a serious life. Think about your future promising profession and not play the guitar. Matthew realized that it was useless to argue. His mother's stubbornness was strong. It was a blessing that she worked a lot and was interested only in her son's grades, regimen, and nutrition. Otherwise, Matthew was exempted from the need to report. If they didn't ask, they could. He got an old guitar, found new strings in the morning before dawn, and asked the music teacher to help him with tuning the instrument. In a couple of days, Matthew had a good guitar, though shabby, but it sounded perfect. He played it on camping trips with his class, at first-grade matinees at school, and in Andrew's father's garage. Open fingers he honed in cold water at night. After a few years, however, the love of strings in the guy waned, and the guitar stayed at Andrew's buddy in the garage finally. "Mom, you've been saving money for my education, and I'm studying on a budget." Matthew started from afar. Let's say Nayli raised her right eyebrow. She wasn't wrong again. "I was thinking that I could get a part-time job in the evenings after school. It's about time. I'm 22 soon." Matthew knew just how to placate his mother before revealing his part-time plans. "Who's stopping you?" Nayli agreed, not yet understanding the connection in her son's words. "Well, I got my license in high school, but I haven't had much practice. I have a license, I have free money, I need a car. I'll go to a cab, earn money, and gain experience. You'll always need a car." Matthew exhaled. "A car." Then Nayli muttered. Matthew waited breathlessly, like a pigeon, waiting for a handful of grain from its master. Nayli was figuring out what the car gave and what it would require. A vehicle of one's own was a convenience. Meanwhile, age was making itself felt with sore knees, blood pressure, and an increasing need to get around. The money spent on the car will not hit the family budget because it was put aside long ago. But the question of earning money, but let her son earn a penny, but really learn to drive, will become more responsible, as she wanted. The main thing is not to neglect his studies. The figures add up. A car is a necessary thing, unlike a guitar, Nayli said more warmly. Matthew opened his mouth. He was already making backup plans, how to persuade his friend to hide the car at his place, how to deal with the evening absence. And now this was a gift. "Do you mind?" he asked with a smile he couldn't quite contain. "I'm not euphoric, but I support it," Nayli replied graciously. "Just be careful what you buy. Don't get a thank you." He hugged his mother, and happy, jumped into the room. Of course, the boy had lied a little. Yes, he did want a part-time job in a taxi cab, but even more than that. Matthew wanted freedom from his mother's control. A car offered that opportunity, even if only partially. He could have bought it on the sly. But that wasn't the way the budding lawyer's mind worked. Matthew realized that he needed to prepare the ground and get his mother's official permission to buy it. Then it would be difficult for her to accuse him of anything. And if you periodically bring in the money you earn, Matthew thinks, you'll get approval and you can relax. A week later, Matthew got a foreign car, though not a new one, but not a bad one. Dan, Andrew's father, personally helped him choose it. And a car mechanic can't go wrong. Andrew persuaded Matthew to celebrate the purchase on the first night, but he refused. Instead, he drove around the neighborhood, at first cautiously, getting used to the character of his new friend, and then boldly drove into the city. The car behaved perfectly. In the morning, Matthew drove his mother to work and then ran to his classes, and in the evening he drove around the streets, picking up passengers. Nayli was at first distrustful of the car, but quickly realized how much relief this means of transportation would bring her. Soon the woman got used to it, and even periodically asked her son if he had refueled the car after work and if it needed washing. Matthew chuckled in secret, but did not show it. He had another reason for buying the car, but no one knew about it. At 15, like any teenager, Matthew's hormones were running wild. He became interested in girls. No, the affable and agile boy had never had any trouble making friends with them. Now he was attracted to his former girlfriends in a different way. He wanted to talk to them, to do nice things for them, not just run around the yard. That's how Matthew got his first girlfriend from the parallel class. But when Nayli found out about it, she made a huge scandal. A cat in a bag. Ask a knowledgeable person for help. And don't try to skip classes and fail your diploma. Mom, I know, Matthew reassured her. Thank you. He hugged his mother and jumped into the room happy. Of course, the boy had lied a little. Yes, he really did want a part-time job in the cab business. But even more than that, Matthew wanted freedom from his mother's control. A car offered that opportunity, even if only partially. He could have bought it on the sly, but that wasn't the way the budding lawyer's mind worked. Matthew realized that he needed to prepare the ground and get his mother's official permission to buy it. Then it would be difficult for her to accuse him of anything. And if you periodically bring in the money you earn, Matthew thinks you'll get approval and you can relax. A week later, Matthew got a foreign car, though not a new one, but not a bad one. Dan, Andrew's father, personally helped him choose it. And a car mechanic can't go wrong. Andrew persuaded Matthew to celebrate the purchase on the first night, but he refused. Instead, he drove around the neighborhood, at first cautiously, getting used to the character of his new friend, and then boldly drove into the city. The car behaved perfectly. In the morning, Matthew drove his mother to work and then ran to his classes, and in the evening he drove around the streets, picking up passengers. Nayli was at first distrustful of the car, but quickly realized how much relief this means of transportation would bring her. Soon the woman got used to it, and even periodically asked her son if he had refueled the car after work and if it needed washing. Matthew chuckled in secret, but did not show it. He had another reason for buying the car, but no one knew about it. At 15, like any teenager, Matthew's hormones were running wild. He became interested in girls. No, the affable and agile boy had never had any trouble making friends with them. Now he was attracted to his former girlfriends in a different way. He wanted to talk to them, to do nice things for them, not just run around the yard. That's how Matthew got his first girlfriend from the parallel class. But when Nayli found out about it, she made a huge scandal. Matthew stood in front of his mother, almost crying, and she lectured him that studying was more important than relationships with girls. The boy wanted to spite his mother by continuing to date the girl of his choice. But Nayli did her best. She found the phone number of the girl's parents and strictly informed them that their daughter was distracting Matthew from his studies. The unyielding tone of the chief accountant put all the dots on I. Matthew had been shunned by a former friend at school. Nayli thought she was doing the right thing, because her own life had never been about the joys of love, only problems and nerves. Why waste precious time on such nonsense? First you have to achieve something, make a reputation, learn, and then look for a suitable couple. And only one that would suit her, Nayli, completely. And some empty-headed girl to stop her Matthew from moving forward. No. Matthew quietly hated his mother's position, but there wasn't much he could do about it. He realized it was useless to argue with her. He had to maintain a secret private life. However, whether it was his aura or Nayli's invisible hand of protection that stretched far away, every new girl did not stay with him for long. At the institute, a quiet horror began around Matthew. Everyone knew where his mother worked, and among graduate students and faculty, gossip spread at the speed of light. And every new girlfriend of her son, the overbearing accountant and part-time faculty member, crucified her classes as best she could. And if she couldn't do it herself, she asked her colleagues to do it for a small favor. One student, Nayli, and her comrades were so driven to such an extent that the poor girl transferred to another university. Matthew eventually realized that if you look for a friend, then outside the institute, where you can hide her from her mother as much as possible. Nothing good came out of this idea. His mother could detect the girl's presence near him by the smell of perfume. She called him if he was late after class. Matthew couldn't get out much, as Nayli encouraged only academic zeal or rare friendships. The shadow of his mother, always invisibly standing behind the young lawyer's back, frightened the girls, and they quickly severed relations with him. Of course, no one wanted to have such a principled and intrusive mother-in-law. Tiana stood in front of the restaurant manager, her tear-red eyes drooping to the floor. For the third time this week, Gavin was sternly reprimanding the waitress just around the corner from the kitchen. "Third time this week you've gotten on my nerves and made me look like an idiot in front of my guests," he said. "But I didn't mean to. I was pushed," the girl tried to justify herself. "We all don't want something. Tiana, you didn't want to break glasses on Monday? You didn't want to forget the dirty rag on the hall table on Wednesday? Didn't want to spill wine on our regular guest today?" The manager folded his arms and lowered his voice, instilling a faint hope in Tiana's heart. "I'll be more careful, honestly, I promise." Gavin sighed irritably. "Promise your mom you'll be back by 11 p.m., and I'll have to fire you. Employees like you are a loss and a disgrace to the establishment. You'll take the money you earned today as a paycheck for your shift and get out of here." Tiana opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. Her eyes stung even more. The manager left. The girl worked a few more hours, despite the dislike of the restaurant's customers. She changed her clothes, stuffed a few bills into the pocket of her cloak, and slipped out of the service exit in a shadow. Only on the street did Tiana allow herself to cry. She had been used to the fact that nothing in life was easy since she was a little girl. Tiana had lost her parents early and knew how hard it was to earn a penny for bread. When she was 7, her family and little brother died in a fire. Nothing was left of the household. The frightened little girl was taken in by an elderly neighbor, Aunt Lexi. She raised the girl, gave her everything she could. But Aunt Lexi could not do much to feed, to drink, to love, and only that. The neighbor's modest money was not enough for beautiful clothes, toys, or sweets. People in the village do not live poorly at all. Tiana helped her mother as much as she could. She took care of the garden and a small farm with a dozen chickens while she was at school. From a small age, Tiana knew how to do everything around the house, cooking and baking. After school, she stayed with Aunt Lexi, even though she insisted on sending her to get an education. "How could I leave you?" Aunt Tiana was carefully smoothing the corner of the pillowcase with an old iron. "Come on, Tiana." Aunt Lexi sat in the chair next to her. "I'm not going anywhere. And you need to get on with your life. You're not going to be cleaning up after me forever." We had this conversation many times. Auntie was cheerful, but Tiana could see that she was finding it harder and harder to do her usual housework every month. In the end, the girl insisted that her aunt go to the city and be examined. The doctors prescribed heart medication and monthly routine checkups. Seeing the prices at the pharmacy, Tiana just splashed her hands. And then she realized that she had to leave after all to move to the city and work so that her aunt could be treated. Without education, it was hard for a girl to find a job, and she had to live somewhere else. On weekends, she took the train to the village to visit her Aunt Lexi. Tiana rented a tiny dorm room on the edge of town and got a job as a cleaner in a shopping center. Things went well at first, but one day she tripped and a bucket of water spilled out. As a result, one of the stores was left without lights and customers for 2 days. Tiana was fired without pay. The girl did not grieve long and decided to try to work as a nanny in a recruitment agency. They looked squeamishly at her manicure-less hands, dirty from working in the vegetable garden and scrubbing floors, and said, "We've looked at your nails and we're asking you to leave." Tiana sighed, but these very dirty by the standards of city ladies' hands did not put down. She started handing out leaflets and newspapers. True, the income from such work was quite modest. Once in those very newspapers, she saw an ad that the restaurant requires an assistant waiter, dishwasher. She was accepted without much questioning, was given gloves, a sponge, and told to start work the same day. For 2 months, the girl worked hard, washed and rubbed glasses, washed plates and pans to a shine. One day in the restaurant, a waitress did not come out. The manager burst into the kitchen, took a quick look at Tiana, told her to change, put on an apron, and go out into the hall to serve the guests. The first few days were hard, but the girl took to the task diligently. She quickly mastered the simple craft of waitressing. "You're fast," Gavin once told her. "It would be easier for me to hire a granny at the car wash than to look for an adequate employee in the hall." Things were going well at first, with customers leaving good tips. Tiana bought herself some decent clothes, sent more money to the village, some guests, and a supply of medicine for her aunt. And then the black streak began. Then that rag absent-mindedly forgotten in a hurry on one of the tables. Then broken dishes. And now a guest poured wine on the table, and finally Tiana was fired. The girl walked down the night street, wiping her tears. The most frustrating thing was that she had already thought that everything was getting better, spent all the money and did not pay for the room on time. And the owners were waiting for payment and were already looking askew at the young tenant. When Tiana got home, she found another surprise. Her belongings had been piled carelessly into a gym bag and put out into the hallway with an obvious hint. There was no more strength to cry. The paycheck for one shift wouldn't be enough to pay for a month in advance. Tiana didn't grovel after being evicted in absentia. The girl grabbed her bag by the handles, unhooked her keys from the keychain, placed them on the bollard next to her, and left. The penetrating October wind blew in her face. She would walk to the train station, and there she would take the first train in the morning to her aunt's village. Cry quietly into her pillow at night, and try again. Each time, though, it was harder and harder, but the health of her family man was more precious to Tiana. Matthew was in a great mood. He had done a good job today. Outside the window, the streetlights, the bright signs, the neon lights of the city in the rain seemed to flow with color. It was even brighter. At night, from the beginning of the shift, the work went as smoothly as possible. There were expensive orders and interesting passengers. Until 6, Matthew discussed with a philosophy professor, laughed with animators in costumes, drove 2 elderly girlfriends to the theater. The guy liked to drive around the city. He felt free and relaxed. Of course, there were some silent passengers, but for some reason they were a minority. The atmosphere in the car apparently disposed even the hardened silent ones to talk. By midnight, the downpour had intensified. Matthew dropped off the last passenger at the edge of town, near the private sector, and decided that it was time to call it a day. He made a leisurely stop at a gas station, picked up a coffee and a sandwich, tipped the gas station attendant, and headed home in a melancholy mood. There were hardly any people on the streets at this late hour, so Matthew was surprised to see a girl walking along the curb. She was soaked through. She was carrying a heavy sports bag in her hands, and her cloak was useless. "Young lady, what are you doing?" "Get in. I'll give you a ride home." The guy stopped and opened the door from the passenger side. "And I have nowhere to go." He heard a completely broken voice. "I don't have a home here, but let me take you somewhere." "The weather's terrible," Matthew insisted. "It's free." He suddenly felt surprisingly sorry for the girl. Not because she was walking alone at night in a downpour, but because Matthew felt a silent call for help. The kind of call you might read in the eyes of a puppy abandoned in a box. "Sit down, please." "I can't leave you here at a time like this." Matthew emphasized the word please very strongly. The stranger, he thought, sighed. Then she skipped over a puddle by the curb and grabbed the door handle. They drove in silence for a while. Matthew turned on the heater to warm the shivering passenger. "How did you end up here?" The boy was the first to ask, and Tiana told him. It was as if she had been saving it all up for months, and now she was out of control. She talked, and Matthew listened until he realized she was crying. "You'll forgive me for sitting here crying like this. It's a terrible shame for you," a stranger, she apologized confusedly as the car stopped at a stoplight. Instead of answering, Matthew pulled some tissues out of the glove compartment. "But why a stranger?" "My name is Matthew." He held out a paper handkerchief to the girl with a smile. Tanya, she sobbed in response. Well, now we know each other. Would you like some coffee or tea? Tanya had no time to answer, as he stopped at another gas station and disappeared in the doorway. 5 minutes later, he handed the girl a hot cup, a small chocolate bar, and threw his jacket from the back seat over her shoulders. They pulled off to the pad to the side. Matthew tried to lighten the mood as best he could, even trying some awkward jokes. This girl's story seemed to him like a mockery of fate, and at the same time he felt a desire to help. It was strange. Matthew wouldn't call himself sentimental or tearful. He didn't give money to beggars, and he wasn't Benjamin. And now I have nowhere to go. I can hardly afford a hotel. I don't know much about the city. Tanya finished her story, warming her fingers on a hot drink. Please bring me to the station. If you don't mind, I'll wait for the train there. You'll freeze at the station in your wet clothes. Stay at my place, and tomorrow I'll take you to the station, Matthew said. The words came out of his mouth before he could think about it. He didn't think about his mother or morality at that moment. He wanted from the bottom of his heart to do something good for his accidental passenger. Tanya froze and for the first time truly stared at Matthew in amazement. He nodded silently, with a slight smile, confirming his offer. And Tanya suddenly agreed. Tired, wet, exhausted, she figured she simply had nothing to lose, and so be it. That late evening, Matthew spoke to his mother in a way he had never spoken to her before. Nellie, of course, was against the idea of her apartment acting as a lodging house for unemployed women. However, for the first time, her son did not ingratiate himself to her or ask for permission, but spoke in a voice as firm as a rock. Nellie felt a chill run down her spine. So different from the Matthew she was used to. She'll clean herself up, and I'll see her off tomorrow morning, he said. Don't embarrass yourself, Mom. If you can't kick the poor girl out, you'll only embarrass yourself in front of her and the neighbors. Matthew firmly contradicted his mother once more and went downstairs to the car to fetch Tiana. Nellie was quietly seething, but for some reason she couldn't object. Had something about him changed that evening? Something that made the woman, against her will, look at her son differently. The university's chief accountant defiantly closed herself in her bedroom and turned off the lights. Matthew put Tiana in his room and moved to the sofa in the living room. The girl's wet clothes were hung on the backs of chairs and radiators. Good night to you, Tiana, he said as he closed the door. Good night to you too. Thank you, the girl replied, lay back on her pillow, closed her eyes, and for the first time in many days truly smiled. Matthew stood outside the door, wondering what had happened to him today. Was it an attack of pity, compassion, an outburst of emotion, or had his soul reached out to someone unfamiliar but dear, someone in need of protection and care? Early in the morning, Nellie got ready for work. She was offended by her son's behavior. To prove it, she had gotten up at the crack of dawn and decided to go to the university herself, though she was used to Matthew driving her. But principle and resentment were dearer. Nellie examined her guest's old-fashioned coat on the rack by the bathroom, then glanced even more squeamishly at the stale, dirty sneakers. Things in the hallway hinted that she was not noted for her tidiness, her limited means. The woman stepped over the stranger's shoes, deciding to wash the hallway with bleach upon her return, and left. The young men awoke almost simultaneously. Matthew saw through the doorway as Tiana timidly tried to find the bathroom. It was not without some awkwardness. Matthew, like a hospitable host, had even made breakfast. But it was made of sandwiches and tea early in the morning, when he himself dropped the unpretentious dishes. The sandwich landed sausage side down and landed on Tiana's pant leg with a piece of butter. The young people stared at the sad piece of salami on the plate for a few seconds, and then laughed. Matthew felt so relaxed and at the same time at ease with this girl that he hadn't even noticed his mother's absence from the morning. Of course, any awkwardness was gone from the conversation. "Are you on your way to the station?" he asked. They chatted like old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. Tiana had forgotten all about what had happened to her yesterday. It was sunny, just like this sunny city. She told her sudden companion about her childhood at her aunt's house, about how she liked to pick dandelion bouquets in the vegetable garden, about the time she was pecked by a rooster, about her first for dictation. There was no sadness or longing in these stories. only carefree childhood and sincere delight of a child. Matthew listened eagerly, attentive to every word, absorbing these pure emotions, which he almost never got from his mother. With her commanding temperament, she was always dry, not praising, not encouraging, not interested in her son's dreams and discoveries. Nayli was preoccupied with the primary worldly tasks: food, regimen, studies, profession, finances. Matthew had enough friends. Teachers at school loved him. Girls were not shy to make eyes at him. But all this was a trifle compared to what this 19-year-old girl from the village told him today. With simplicity, purity, and trust. They waited for the train together, sitting on the platform. "Thank you very much." "I don't know how to thank you," Tiana said again with some awkwardness as she said goodbye. "It's okay," Matthew dismissed her. "But I do. Let's meet again when you get back and go to the movies." Tiana was a girl from the countryside who had come to the city. She met Matthew and a warm friendship developed between them. Matthew was charmed by Tiana's openness, spontaneity, and cheerfulness, something he lacked in his relationship with his own strict mother, Nayli. When Tiana was leaving, Matthew suggested that they meet again when she came to town and go to a movie. Tiana was happy at the prospect. Upon returning home, Matthew faced the displeasure of Nayli's mother, who considered Tiana a country wench and tried to get rid of any trace of her in the apartment with bleach. A conflict arose, during which Matthew for the first time openly confronted his mother, tired of her excessive control over his life. This situation highlighted the overdue contradictions between Matthew and his mother Nayli. On the one hand, Nayli cared for her son, but at the same time she was overprotective and tried to impose her rigid attitudes on him. And Matthew, having met Tiana, felt a longing for freedom, lightness, and spontaneity in relationships. This story touches on the themes of growing up, gaining independence, the value of simple human joys, and the ability to assert one's boundaries even in relationships with loved ones. The clash of two life philosophies caused a generational conflict between mother and son. "I'm sick of your control," said Nayeli. "I see you've picked up a lot of chutzpah from that hillbilly too." "Better chutzpah than a lifetime of being told what to do by someone else," Matthew said, and slammed the front door so hard that the figurines fell from the table. He slept in the car that night. Such loud arguments with his mother had never happened before. The boy had always held back or avoided sharp edges with cunning, but now something had been hurt that didn't want to put up with the insults. Tiana didn't tell her aunt what had happened. She said she was just visiting for a few days. The perceptive relative immediately noticed that her stepdaughter was unusually joyful. "But Tiana, tell me, did you meet someone?" Aunt Lexi asked at dinner. The girl burst out in surprise and dropped her spoon into her plate, splashing the table. Aunt Lexi laughed. "Ouch. You don't have to answer that. I can already see that I've met a handsome man." Tiana told her named mother about Matthew. "The main thing is that the man is good. You don't see much selfless help these days." Aunt Lexi patted her stepdaughter's shoulder approvingly. "Auntie, I don't think I'm right for him," Tiana said. "And anyway, maybe that's true. I was already dreaming of a house with a rose garden." "And if you don't dream, then why live?" The woman was genuinely surprised. "You should have fallen in love a long time ago. In my childhood, there was only school, vegetable garden, chickens. I'm old, you'll be sitting on my neck." "But Auntie, don't say that," Tiana objected. "Who else but me will help you? Youth is for dreaming, for joy, for falling in love. And you are doing a great deal for me. Go and meet him, and I'll give you something to dress up." Aunt Lexi got up and went into her room. From there she heard the noise and creaking of an old closet. Soon the woman returned with 2 stud earrings. "This is what my late husband Alex gave me for my wedding in 1973. Ural emerald, a good luck stone." She placed the jewelry in the palm of the amazed Tiana's hand. The earrings were small, but elegant, even noble. The light green stone played in the sun, shimmering with facets. Aunt Lexi easily pushed Tiana to the mirror to try on the gift, and it was as if the jewelry was made for the girl. The emerald earrings looked even more beautiful against her brown hair. "Well, what's not a bride to be?" "Well done," Aunt Lexi said with a pat on the knee. Tiana laughed and took another sneak peek at herself in the reflection. That same night, Matthew called her himself. They chatted about everything and nothing. For about half an hour, the guy said he'd meet her at the train station. Also that he had a surprise. Tiana exhaled, awkwardly said goodbye, and went to bed, gazing dreamily at the fishnet shadows on the ceiling. Matthew did apologize to Nayli's mother for being rude when he cooled down. Still, the heated atmosphere in the apartment was hitting a nerve. It was amazing how Matthew had been practicing law at the university, operating with articles and laws, arguing with his professors, but he had been unable to defend his opinion to his mother until that day, because she had built her unquestionable rightness and authority into his head. Nayli listened to her son's apology and pretended to accept it too. But the coolness of the relationship betrayed the truth. Perhaps she was a little more critical of her son than usual, as if she were getting back at him for the offense. And he seemed impenetrably indifferent. About his studies, about cars, about passengers at work. Fears and worries. The invisible grit, he shook off his shirt and adjusted the collar of his coat. A worm of worry coiled inside Nayli. Had something changed? Whereas before she could confidently say she knew her Matthew from the get-go, now she couldn't. He was with her, and not with her at the same time. She'd been tempted to ask her son about her concerns several times, but she didn't know how to begin. The control she'd built her life around had been broken. The day of their second meeting was unusually warm for October. The sun was so hot that Tiana had taken off her cloak and was carrying it in her hands. Matthew even wore dark sunglasses, though he hid his eyes, which kept looking at the girl, her hair, her figure, her eyes, the polka dots on her blouse, the neat earrings. Every detail Matthew wanted to memorize and keep. In 3 days he'd missed her so much it felt like they hadn't seen each other in forever. "So what's the surprise?" Tiana asked, tucking an embarrassed strand behind her ear. Matthew nodded enigmatically and took her hand, calmly and confidently at the same time. In that gesture, all the worry, fuss, and concern dissolved. They walked down a long alley littered with yellow maple leaves and found themselves in a pet store. "Do you want to get me a hamster?" Tiana laughed. Matthew only smiled again. "Look here for a moment," he said, and disappeared behind the racks of aquariums. Tiana looked at the strange fish, the funny guinea pigs, and the noisy parrots. She liked the atmosphere, and she had always loved animals. She used to feed the chickens from her hands as a little girl, stroking their feathers, but they only clucked and looked into her face with their bird eyes. Tiana was distracted from her thoughts when through the bars she was playing with a parrot, as green as a young pea. "I see you've already got the hang of it. You've got the hang of it," joked a small woman in an apron with the store's emblem. "Hello, Tiana. My name is Olivia. Can it be Olivia? Matthew told me you were looking for a job." "Aunt Olivia is my best friend Alex's mom," Matthew explained. "And she'd love to have you if you'd like to work for her, of course." Tiana couldn't believe her ears with joy. Yes, I agree. I'm ready to start today," she blurted out. Olivia laughed. "That's the spirit. But today is not necessary. In 2 or 3 days, find a place to live, and then call me." She handed Tiana her business card, confused and happy at the same time. Matthew had a few words with the friendly pet store owner, and they walked out. "This is the second time you've helped me?" "I already feel very uncomfortable about it," Tiana said. The girl looked at Matthew. "I didn't do anything," she said, jokingly raising her hands. "A car brought you home to me, and Aunt Oberon took you to work." "Of course she did," Tiana laughed and poked Matthew in the side with a finger of poorly hidden pride. Matthew whooped and laughed and immediately started tickling Tiana in return. They ran down the street like fools, one after another, giggling like schoolboys. Passers-by turned to look at the strange couple. But for them, the world gradually shrank to just each other. "Would you point your finger at me again if I said I'd help you a third time?" Matthew asked when they were out of breath. Tiana opened her mouth but said nothing. "Let's go somewhere," Matthew suggested. "And then we can go to the movies. I think we can make it in time." He looked at his wristwatch. 15 minutes later, the boys pulled up in front of the university dormitory. Matthew was friends with the head of the group, and he got along with the commandant. A small gift, a thank you envelope, a story about a poor relative, and he agreed to let the pseudo-student stay for a month or two. all the more so because Tiana's age was more than suitable. However, the commandant asked her to keep out of sight of the teachers and to come before 22. "Are you a wizard, honestly?" Tiana stared at Matthew as they walked outside with the room key. The boy scrutinized his chin and the back of his head, and then stated with a very serious look. "So no beard, like Hotabike. The magic hat is also missing. Verdict? No, I'm not a wizard." Matthew leaned over to Tiana and whispered conspiratorially, "Well, maybe a little." He made her laugh playfully and cleverly solved in one-day problems that took her weeks to solve. It was beginning to seem to her that the fairy tales her aunt had told her as a child were coming true. "Let's hurry." Matthew took her hand again, firm and gentle at the same time. "We have a movie starting in 20 minutes. It was one of the most joyous days of Matthew's life in recent memory. Yes, he'd skipped class today. Yes, he wouldn't go to work tonight. Yes, his mother would freak out if she found out. But why? Right now he feels needed and happy. And happiness is definitely worth a couple unattended lectures and a few missed passengers. Nayli tapped her pencil nervously on her desk. She had given the students an assignment. They sat like mice and wrote, while the instructor was lost in her own thoughts. 15 minutes ago, the department told her that Matthew had skipped class. He hadn't been in class before or after lunch. The helpful group supervisor had even asked Nayli if her son was all right. The woman threw something discreet in response, but inside her a mixture of resentment, frustration, and intense misunderstanding was slowly simmering. Matthew didn't pick up his phone and turned it off altogether. When had she not seen him treat her like that? So what if he became an adult? A mother should be respected at any age. She wants what's best for him to have a future, to become a powerful man, to make a name and a career. Where did it all start? Well, I guess it started with the unfortunate car. Yeah, that was a mistake. She let him, it was her own fault, believing a young man's good intentions. And now she's looking for him in that car. He's out of control. He feels he can do anything. So we've got to get rid of her as soon as possible. And Matthew can go back to being a good student and a good son. And if he wants to work, he can be a paralegal. You can't trust a man, even if it is your own child. She knows what's best. She's lived her life and managed to settle down well only because of her savvy, calculating, and pragmatic nature. So she can beat the crap out of a young guy's head. He'll thank her later, when his classmates are trampling the training ground in their boots. It's Daddy's bad blood. Nayli remembered her father. He, too, had been doing things during their short relationship. At first she'd even liked it, but then it became clear that without organization and discipline, nothing good would come of it. And a little later the beau made it clear what he really wanted. He was noodling about eternal love, encouraging Nayli to register him at her place. She couldn't let Matthew, whom she'd raised all her life, suddenly turn off the well-thought-out path. The weeds of excessive freedom, dubious girlfriends, and the like must be pulled out at the root. The chief accountant was distracted from his thoughts by a call from the class. The students hurriedly began to hand in their papers. Nayli didn't even glance at the stack of papers that piled up in the corner of her desk a couple minutes later. In her mind, she was already creating a plan to save her son and get him back on track. Matthew had come home in a light, uplifted mood, and that made the air sparkle. Nayli's mood was diametrically opposed. "Matthew, is there anything you want to tell me?" she asked, as soon as his son entered the kitchen and began to pour his tea. "No, Mom. Nothing yet." He smiled radiantly at his mother from the other end of the kitchen. "So skipping class isn't enough reason to talk?" Nayli tried to hold back the outrage that was bursting out of her. Matthew's hand hovered in the air, a teaspoonful of sugar. He exhaled, then carefully poured the sugar into the cup and stirred the contents leisurely. "Mom, I'm a grown man. If there are tales on my studies from my absence, I'll deal with them myself. Don't be so nervous." Nayli's calm, measured tone made her son's voice boil even more. "Why are you embarrassing me? Do you want people to point the finger at me for having a truant son?" "No, Mom, you want to make a big deal out of nothing. One day of absenteeism is not the disaster you pictured." Matthew still spoke firmly and calmly, though it cost him some effort. For some reason, after talking to Jenny, he felt more mature, stronger, more confident. The weight that had been weighing on his shoulders since childhood and preventing him from objecting to his parent had dissolved into oblivion. With absenteeism, everything begins. Then women, then stupid adventures. Before you know it, you'll be without a diploma, without a profession, and without a decent place in life, Nayli said. Mom, stop making such a big deal out of it, please. Matthew sighed tiredly and rubbed his temples. The lightness and the wonderful impression of the day were gone because of this inane interrogation. Nayli, like a horse that had been yanked backwards at the most crucial moment, felt the invisible thread of her control over her son fleeing further and further ahead. Tell me, why did you skip your classes? The woman asked. I went to get my car repaired, Matthew replied. He realized that the truth would make his mother even more furious, so he said the first thing that came into his head. You think I can't see you're lying? Nayli threw the towel over her shoulder and put her hands to her sides. What car? I'm old, Matthew, but I'm not crazy. I've been fixing the car, the guy said expressively, separating his words with pauses. Give me the keys, Nayli demanded. I bought this car for you, and I'll take it back. What happened next broke some shudder in the woman's mind. Matthew silently pulled a bundle from his pocket, unhooked the alarm keys from it, and placed them in his mother's palm. Nayli stared at them stupidly somehow. The emotional army looked out from behind them confusedly, not realizing where the enemy had gone. Take it. Only you can't drive. That's one thing. Matthew began to curl his fingers defiantly. You can't sell it without the owner's signature. Me, that's two. In the end, your money, as you say, will rot in the yard, or will become the prey of car thieves when they find a car without an owner for several months. That's three. Nayli stared at him in amazement, gulping for air. Matthew calmly took the keys. Then he came very close and said quietly but seriously, Don't forget who I'm studying for, even if I occasionally skip classes. The guy took a mug of tea from the table and left the kitchen. The incident was over. The first stage of Nayli's plan had collapsed like a house of cards. She didn't like the job. For the first few weeks, she'd come to it as if it were an out-of-the-way place. Oberon marveled at how quickly the girl grasped everything and even did more on instinct. But the village childhood and her experience in caring for animals had its effect. Tiana quickly realized that she loved these hamsters, and what treats can only be given to parrots. In one day, she sorted through a warehouse of pet food. Then she cleaned 2 old aquariums to a shine which were dusty in the back room. Well done, praised her store owner. You can buy new fish if there is room. Tiana was not tired in the slightest. The work did not exhaust her as before. In the evening, she came to the dormitory, read books, or looked for information about her furry feathered charges on the net. She didn't want to collapse on the bed and fall asleep. This peculiar training has borne fruit. The customers listened to the girl enthusiastically. When they faced the choice of buying a pet, Tiana sat little mice in the arms of children, showed how to properly catch fish with a net from the aquarium, explained how to teach parrots to talk. Oberon could not be pleased with such a smart and diligent worker. Tiana herself was quietly pleased. She was afraid to rejoice loudly. Everything was going too well in her life. She was used to breaking through, climbing, gnawing her teeth with tears in her eyes. And her aunt said that there were plenty of envious eyes around, and they were not even necessarily acquaintances. That's how you rejoice, and some offended by life lady on the street spit and wishes you nasty things. So it is better to be quiet, but be sure that happiness will not go anywhere. The girl told me how she had settled down. She unobtrusively asked about Matthew, but Tiana did not refuse. They saw each other 2 or 3 times a week. Matthew would stop by her place of work before his shift in a cab. They would sit in the corner of the store like a pair of canaries. Oberon had once scolded Matthew for interfering with Tiana's work, but then waved it off, seeing the boys' glances at each other. Tiana hated to let him go every time, but she was afraid to say so. The range of emotions around Matthew was off the charts. She felt like a fool when he explained some historical facts with an important look. Then she was embarrassed and blushed. If he brought her goodies and small nice gifts, she sank in his eyes as in a cup of fragrant tea. Once he waited for her after the store closed. They drove around town all evening, and then Matthew handed her a neat bouquet. Never had any man treated her so simply and tenderly at the same time. not counting her aunt. But here was different. There was care, a twinge of shyness, a fear of offending, a desire to protect and shelter her under his wing. Tiana could feel it all without words. She'd once tried to start a conversation about thanking him for helping her with her job and housing. But Matthew put his finger to his lips and smiled. She was drawn to him more and more each day. When Tiana went to the village, she missed him especially. She wanted to put her arms around him, snuggle her nose into his chest and be silent. Smiling in love, she finally remembered that you can live and work not only for someone or for the sake of someone, but also just for yourself. Of course, Tiana never stopped sending her aunt money and worrying about her health. But for the first time, she realized that she could exhale and slow down a bit. That there were simple everyday joys that you didn't have to run ahead, and sometimes you could even let yourself relax. October was over, and rainy, cold November came, followed by December. But not everyone was in the same gloomy mood. In Matthew's mind, the sun was shining all the time, whether he was in classes or driving to work. Time dragged on, but with Tiana, it flew by like a blink. His mother was behind him, or pretended to be. He didn't really care. Matthew didn't respect or love her any less. He just realized it was time to protect his personal space. Funny how it was only meeting the girl from the village that put things in perspective. Before, he had waited anxiously for his parents' approval and worried about her every no, even though he found an alternative. Matthew also realized that his mother would definitely not approve of his affair with Tiana. Not now, anyway. That's why he hid the girl's presence in every possible way. Why create unnecessary conflicts? When the time came, he'd introduce them for real. Toward the end of the year, every accountant is overwhelmed. You have to make reports, summarize all the documents, add up debit and credit. And, as is always the case, some certificates and forms were missing. Nayli had to send a couple of graduate students to lead the way, and herself to search for the necessary papers. She preferred to do everything in advance. There were enough examples around of those who procrastinated until the last-minute, sleepy students turning in their tails, and young professors cursing the university's bureaucratic system while trying to fill out all the journals in a day before an audit. Why do people have such a lack of respect for numbers? After all, you just have to start and everything in life goes according to plan. Someone will stop being late, someone will find out where most of their money goes, and someone will make an informed decision. Nayli thought. On their head, like a perfectionist, everything was in order. Accounting, Alex's student house. Matthew's shelf was empty. Outwardly, everything was the same, and she couldn't charge anything to her son based on maternal suspicion alone. But that same instinct told her that her son had changed. More precisely, he stopped listening to her. Break. All the shelves in the study. Nayli realized she had to go to the university dormitory. The necessary documents were bound to be there with the commandant. At first, Nayli had thought of sending a young assistant to the dormitory, but then something compelled her to go herself. And, as it turned out, for good reason. As soon as she came around the corner, she saw a familiar car in the parking lot in front of the dormitory. Matthew was standing next to it, reverently embracing a girl in an unremarkable gray jacket, but with a bright green scarf. The head accountant lurked around the corner like a detective. Then she took out her cell phone and snapped a couple of pictures. "So this is the mouse responsible for all my son's changes," the woman whispered, peering at Tiana through the panes of her glasses. At first, Nayli wanted to give her offspring a beating right there in the parking lot. But experience told her to be more subtle. She'd already kept more than one skirt away from her boy. It would be easy to deal with a skirt like that. Nayli even hid her face from all pictures of her son. It seemed to her the most disgusting prank. The woman waited until the couple had left, and with a determined look, she made her way to the commandant's office. "First, I decided to get all the necessary paperwork, and then to nail the guardian of the peace of the dormitory to the wall with personal questions. I've got a truant student who lives here. I want to talk to her." Nayli began from afar as the papers were already in her bag. "Whoever we find will be punished." The commandant, who liked to show off to the faculty on occasion, was keenly interested. True, this did not prevent him from covering student parties and absences for a small payoff. But here's the trouble. I don't remember the name and I've only seen it once, but here's a photo. Help me find this shameless one. Nayli shoved her phone under the commandant's nose, where Tiana's face was clearly visible. He turned up his nose predatorily, but then faltered, like a hound mistaking an empty tin can for a partridge. Not ours exactly, he shrugged. What do you say? Why don't you send an inspection down here? Have you had an accounting for a long time? And Repairs Naley raised one eyebrow expressively. I'm a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience. The commandant's eyes flickered. He was choosing the lesser of evils. Considering that some of the public property was written off, or sold, and the pipes and electrics were kept on duct tape and word of honor, he didn't need any inspections. To get the full because of the mess in the dormitory, or to get a little because of the lieutenant, the choice was obvious. But actually, said the commandant, she lives in room 302, but it is temporary, at the request of a relative from the village. Only then he realized that the girl in question could not be a student, which meant that she had not been truant. But it was too late. Apparently the law doesn't apply to you, said Naley. Apparently an audit wouldn't hurt after all. The head accountant adjusted her glasses, turned to the door, and walked out. By evening, Naley knew everything about Tiana, who she was, where she came from, what she was doing in the dormitory, and how she had gotten there. The story of a village girl with no education who was trying desperately to get a foothold in the city had set things straight. The woman realized that she was not wrong in her premonitions. She made a couple of calls and hung up the receiver of the working landline phone on the lever in satisfaction. Matthew looked at the time. It was almost 7 p.m. Tiana would be finishing work in half an hour. The young people agreed to go for a walk. The weather was just right. It was snowing without wind. The city seemed to be covered with a downy shawl. The guy took a couple of cups of coffee, Tiana's favorite chocolate, and went along a familiar route. But going into the store, saw instead of Joy crying girl and consoling her Oberon. Nothing, Tianushka, I can wait until you get settled again. The kind pet store owner stroked Tiana's back. What's wrong? Matthew rushed over to them, not forgetting his coffee, which he nearly spilled. Everything's gone. They evicted me from the dormitory. Tiana wiped away her tears. They said only students could live there. Well, why am I surprised? I'm the one who sat down. Matthew berated himself. You should have found another place to live a long time ago. Where's the stuff? Is it in the warehouse over there? Oberon nodded at the door behind the cash register. It's not your fault, Tiana said. I'm the one who got too relaxed. Let's go. Let's try to do something. Matthew took the bags from behind the door. Aunt Abby, if Tiana doesn't work for a couple of days, nothing will happen. Oh, come on, Matthew. The woman waved her hand. Well, I'm not human, am I? Of course I'll wait. Besides, you can't throw away such workers. Tiana looked at her employer with grateful eyes, and then at Matthew, who was already holding her jacket. Come on, Eagles, you've got work to do. Oberon admonished them before they left. The snow was still circling in the air, falling carelessly, dancing. Next to Matthew, Tiana immediately became calmer. He certainly wouldn't let her stay out at night. They got into the car, stowed their bags. We'll check into a hotel tonight, and tomorrow we'll find you an apartment, he said. But let's stop by my place. I think I left my car papers in my room. If the police stop me, I don't want to pay a fine. Sure, let's go. Tiana nodded and unconsciously hugged Matthew's arm. While they reached their destination, they called several hotels and very soon found a free and inexpensive room. They could exhale a little. As the car pulled into the driveway, Tiana's cell phone suddenly rang. She thought that it was the hotel receptionist, so she picked up the phone without looking at the screen. After a couple of minutes, the phone slipped out of her hands and fell on the seat. What? Who called? Matthew saw Tiana sit up with a determined face and saw her eyes fill with tears again. Auntie's been taken to the hospital, Tiana muttered with wooden lips. It was the neighbor who called the ambulance. Matthew pulled her to him and hugged her. Why is all this coming down on you? He stroked her hair and felt her shaking with sobs and tears. And Tiana was crying again, only out of helplessness. She had only just begun to believe in miracles as life brought her harshly back to reality. Matthew, it's okay. It's going to be okay. Calm down. Let's go to your aunt's. What hospital did they take her to? Matthew started fumbling in the armrests. In the meantime, have a drink. Tears won't help, but your eyes will hurt. He took out a plastic bag of pills and a bottle of mineral water. And then what they call a fatal accident happened. Tiana swallowed the pills and began coughing desperately. Matthew, in a panic, rushed to pound the girl's back and search for water around the car. But there was no more. He realized that just a little more, and they would have to go to the hospital for another reason. There was no choice but to go up to the apartment to get a glass of water. Matthew flew into the kitchen without taking off his shoes and immediately met the surprised gaze of Nayli's mother. All she could see was her son rushing back into the hallway with the hair dryer and the glass, and that there was someone coughing desperately. A few seconds later, the eyes of the unofficial mother-in-law and daughter-in-law met, the former's full of contempt, arrogance, and disgust, the latter's frightened and confused. "Why did you bring this here?" Nayli didn't even bother to call Tiana anything other than it. "Mom, can't you see? Is she sick?" Matthew stood up for his friend. "I see." The chief accountant wrinkled her nose squeamishly. "And she wants to get a better job at your expense." Matthew stepped between his mother and Tiana. "You've lost the last vestiges of your humanity with your numbers," he said, putting his back to the girl. "No, son. You've lost your mind." Nayli raised her hand and poked Tiana with her finger. "That girl's just a country girl. She'll move in, get pregnant, saddle you up in our apartment, and make money out of you." Tiana felt dizzy, whether from the fact that she could breathe normally at last, or from the words of this scary woman hitting her like a rod. "I'd rather lose my mind with her than go on living with you on a leash," Matthew said, pulling Tiana close to him. Matthew turned his back to his outraged mother and hugged Tiana, who was trembling with shock. And out they went. To the hospital, the young people drove in silence. The girl no longer had the strength for emotions, and the guy was ashamed in front of her. In the hospital, Tiana barely made her way through the nurses to Aunt Ida's room. The woman was unexpectedly cheerful and was discussing something with another patient. "Auntie?" Tiana looked at her with a mixture of joy and bewilderment. The old woman went into the cellar and slipped on the last step. I went tumbling. Aunt Ida began to tell her story so contagiously cheerful that everyone present involuntarily smiled. I was sitting on a pile of potatoes. My leg was curled up. Somehow my neck, the crown, and the soup fell out. I got up somehow. Our neighbor went into the barn. I called out to her. And that's how I ended up here. "Oh, Aunt Ida. Do you know how to scare?" Tiana laughed and hugged the woman. "It's a sprain. They put a plaster cast on me, covered the abrasions with green, but left them." Aunt Ida nodded at the pile of papers on the nightstand next to Tiana's familiar mother. Tiana was immediately relieved. She was happy that everything had worked out. Neither lost housing nor nasty words could be more important than the love of those closest to her. Matthew's head poked into the room. He was tired of tramping down the hall. Come in, young man." Aunt Ida waved her hand invitingly, a little embarrassed. "Your guests. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." Tiana introduced them to each other. In a couple of minutes, the conversation was already flowing animatedly. It was so easy and relaxed for all three of them, as if they were not in a hospital room, but on the veranda of a country house on a Saturday sunset. They chatted until the nurse asked the visitors to leave, as the time had passed 22. "We'll come tomorrow," Tiana promised. Come. Just the two of you." Aunt Ida winked at them both approvingly. When Matthew didn't come home the first night, Nayli had treated it as a whim. When Matthew didn't show up the second, third night either, Nayli began to worry. And when one day some of his things disappeared, she realized that the usual order had been broken. In the mind of a woman who had spent her life measuring by numbers, what had happened was incomprehensible. The unfortunate broken cup came to mind. On the fourth day, Nayli caught Matthew in the corridor of the university. "When are you coming home?" she asked him sternly but worriedly. "I'm fine," Mom, Matthew replied distantly and coldly. "Don't be nervous." He pulled his elbow out of his mother's palm and headed off to his next class. Matthew and Tiana rented an apartment. A neighbor looked after the household in the village. There, in that tiny room of an old 5-story building, Matthew felt as cozy and good as he had never felt anywhere else. He already knew that this girl would definitely become his wife. Her inner world, her childlike directness, her marvelous sense of beauty charmed him. Her borscht cutlets could compete with restaurant dishes, an affectionate embrace in the evenings energized and relaxed at the same time. Tiana stopped by Aunt Lexi's hospital every day before work. Tiana had a fiancé. Aunt Lexi laughed. What a fiancé. Tiana waved away the beet red Tiana. I'm old, but I'm not bad. I see that you both bloom like a flower on a May afternoon, the woman said good-naturedly, patting her stepdaughter on the head. Matthew smiled at the words, for they were true. When Aunt Lexi was discharged, the young men took her to the village. The elderly woman, limping but alert, joked constantly. From that day on, Matthew began going to see her with Tiana almost constantly. He liked the village atmosphere, the peace and tranquility. He had never had any relatives in the countryside, so everything was a wonder. The young man looked at the house and yard with keen interest, zealously brushed the snow and constantly found something to do that required a man's hand. He changed the faucet, insulated the wiring, rehung the doors on the kitchen cabinets. Walk with the one Aunt Lexi elbowed Tiana while standing in the hallway. Tired of planting potatoes and digging beds in the spring, Tiana said, I'd love to. Matthew crawled out from under the sink with a wrench, and Tiana laughed. Periodically, the couple's idyll in the village or in the apartment was broken by Nayli's phone calls. She asked Matthew to come back, shouted at him, threatened him, begged him, but the boy was adamant. Yes, it was hard to combine studying, working in a cab, and traveling out of town. On weekends, I had to deny myself something to pay the rent, but it was better than living under orders and constant control. Mom, I'm fine. Don't be so nervous, Matthew answered with the usual phrases without appealing to his conscience. Neither entreaties nor even tears could make him become comfortable and proper by his mother's standards again. In the end, Matthew began to be at home, but for a tick, and kept his new address a secret. He never refused help, but he kept his distance and continued to assert his personal boundaries. Nayli's anger was replaced by jealousy, powerlessness, and it flowed into resentment. Colleagues said different things, who scolded the village girl, who suggested to get away from his son. But all agreed in one thing: at such a young age, so nervous will not do any good. Several months had passed since mid-April. Spring burst into town with cherry blossoms and the scent of the first daffodils. Nayli, though tired, could not fully accept the fact that her son lived apart. One warm day, when the sun was almost summertime, the accountant returning from work sat down on a bench in the lilac bushes. Usually Nayli never sat on it with her neighbors, considering it beneath her dignity to watch passers-by. But today her new shoes rubbed her foot, and she had no choice. Daniel, an elderly neighbor, came out of the entryway, leaning on a stick. He was a quiet old man who lived on the first floor, tended the flower beds, fed the birds, and never bothered anyone. It's a beautiful day today, he greeted Nayli, lifting his old-fashioned hat. Terrible. My feet are all blistered, she mumbled back. My son's been on my nerves since winter. Work's a mess. It's not beautiful. Feet will heal. Work is not a wolf. And I can fix my son, Daniel shouted and went about his business. He left his mother. Dumped her, Nayli grumbled. I was like you when I was young. Nayli, the neighbor, suddenly changed his tone. I also scolded my daughter for falling in love early. She married a tailor instead of a military man. Nayli, who had a lot of unfriendly thoughts swirling around in her head, suddenly had them scattering like sparrows from a bush. And nothing. She's graduated from the institute, teaches dancing to kids. Happy. Her eyes are shining. And now I'm happy about my granddaughter, Nayli. I took her to the circus when she was little. Now she's running from school with a certificate. Grandpa. She's all grown up now. Daniel sat down on the bench next to Nayli. What does this have to do with my son? She asked in bewilderment. It has to do with the fact that you have to let your children go in time, that you can't make a bed for them everywhere, so let them make their own mistakes and learn their own way. You want it better, but can he have it better in his head? The old man looked at Nayli carefully. How could he know? the woman began. The old man interrupted her and looked into her eyes clearly, but slightly sternly. "Do you want to see your grandchildren?" There was something in that look that made Nayli's inner rebel surrender, embarrassed, hide in a far corner. "I do," she said, barely audibly. "And if you keep fighting with your son, you won't see it." Daniel folded his hands on the hilt of his cane. "It's about time he flew out of the nest and made his own. Is he a boy? Let's go." Nayli sighed. The elderly neighbor simply and without ceremony revealed the truth that she had feared all her life and did not want to admit that her son would grow up sooner or later, that he would not replace her husband. Life really isn't just about numbers and controlling every event around her. Nayli turned all suitors away, fearing they would take up her living space, and ended up alone. She drove the girls away from her son, and he still chose the one he liked. She did not spare even the students, even though they diligently studied her subjects and were afraid of absences. She only pointed, controlled, criticized, seeking to fill the void in her own soul. No matter how you look at it, it's a beautiful day. Daniel drew an air noisily and shouted happily, pointing to a tree. "Look, a tit." He watched the bird with interest. Nayli nodded and smiled. The black and white bird hopped about the branches with a stick in its beak. At one point it dropped its find, made a loud squeak, and then flew to the ground, picked up the wand and flew away with it. Tiana and Matthew gathered in the village in the early morning of May 1st to help Aunt Lexi with chores for the holiday, cleaning up the grounds, planting vegetables. In the evening the plan was kebabs, baked potatoes, and a picnic. The young people had already left the house and were packing their bags with things in the car. Suddenly Matthew was called by a familiar voice. He turned around. "Mom, how are you here?" He was surprised. "I mean, how did you find me?" Tiana froze in front of the car. She was overcome by the echoes of that nasty feeling, when in winter she stood on the doorstep of a stranger's apartment and listened to nasty things about herself. "Old friends helped," Nayli answered. "I wanted to talk about everything that had happened." Her mother's voice was unaccustomedly soft, not dictatorial. There was a hint that she was holding them back. Or maybe it was something else. "Mom, if you're talking about the same thing again, my decision hasn't changed." Matthew grabbed his bag of things. "No, son, Suddenly tears came out of Nayli's voice and she began to wipe them away with her fingers. Tiana and Matthew were hurrying Tiana to get her out of her stupor, and Matthew because he had never seen his mother cry in his life. There were times he wondered if she was even capable of it. The boy hastily put his arm around the woman and began to soothe her. "Don't cry, Mom, everything is fine. What's wrong?" "Oh, Matthew, son, I have so much to tell you." Nayli turned to Tiana, "and to apologize to you. Come with us to the village." Matthew looked at his mother. "We'll rest, we'll sit, we'll get to know everyone. It's a holiday, it's spring." He nodded to Tiana, and she tilted her head in agreement, showing that she supported the idea. Aunt Lexi took the unexpected guest's visit well. Tiana had never told her about what had happened between her and her chosen one's mother, so the acquaintance was easy and relaxed. Nayli and Aunt Lexi found common ground surprisingly quickly and began discussing recipes while sitting at a table in front of the porch. Matthew had pulled the table from the kitchen in anticipation of the evening's gatherings. The women tried to help the young men clean up the grounds, but they only waved their hands. "Why are you staring at your mom like you're seeing her for the first time?" Tiana nudged Matthew lightly with her elbow as they cleaned up last year's dry leaves and branches from the vegetable garden. "I saw her for the first time." The young man leaned his gloved hands on the handle of the rake. "Not a real one. How is this woman different from the one who all my childhood fed me porridge, according to the regimen, scolded me for being 2 minutes late?" By evening, when all the pressing matters were over, the kebabs were fried and the table was set, the small group finally sat down together. Nayli, who had traveled light from the city, covered herself with a fur shawl. Aunt Lexi got the house wine, set out the best appetizers. She'd even laid a festive white tablecloth, which everyone had persistently discouraged her from doing. When, if not tonight, the stubborn hostess diligently straightened the corners and smoothed the pattern in the center. Tiana turned on the antique radio, which, like a grasshopper, stuck its long antenna whiskers out the window, and the chatter of the presenters and retro songs came on. The evening became especially soulful when it got dark and some smooth melody played on the airwaves. Nelly suddenly rose from the table, glass in hand. "I want to apologize," she began, taking a deep breath. "First and foremost to you, Tiana. I behaved abominably. I apologize for my rudeness, my arrogance. I can see that my son is happy with you, and for any mother, that is what matters most." Tiana smiled with one eye at Nelly's mute question. As she continued, "I want to apologize to you, Matthew. I've tried to be the best mother for you, to replace your father and grandparents. But in this list of duties and discipline, I forgot about the simple moments of warmth, childhood joys, and your dreams. Forgive me, my boy." She discreetly took the napkin from her son's hands and blotted her wet eyes again. "Mother, you'd better stop it." "There's no need to apologize," Matthew took the woman's hand. No, I know what I'm saying," Nelly interrupted him. She looked at Aunt Lexi. "And I want to apologize to you too." "Why should I apologize?" The hostess splayed her hands, nearly knocking over the decanter. "To you and all the people who live in the villages. I always thought of them as second class, uneducated and stupid. I see now that I was terribly mistaken. It was only in my old age that I realized the blinders I'd been wearing all my life." Nelly exhaled and drank all that was in the glass in a gulp. "Oh, what a useless girl you are. We need a vegetable garden, and we have rattles in our hands." Aunt Lexi scolded her. "But since tonight is such an evening, I have something to say, too." Matthew looked around at the crowd. "The first news is that I've been hired as a paralegal. After the semester ends, I'm going to start practicing my profession. The second," he turned to Tiana, who was all animated with anticipation. For her, the news of the paralegal was indeed a surprise. But the real surprises were ahead. "Tiana." Matthew turned to her with his whole body. "I'd like to believe that a girl like you wouldn't give up the humble burden of being a lawyer's wife." That's how it happened that night. "Will you marry me?" Matthew asked. Aunt Lexi opened her mouth in surprise. Nelly let a second wave of tears fall, barely recovering from her loud apology. Tiana stared in amazement at the thin dainty ring in a simple box. "I'll do it with the cab driver's husband," she exclaimed, jumped up and hugged Matthew tightly, not believing what was happening. After the hugs, congratulations, and toasts, they began a loud discussion about the upcoming wedding. Aunt Lexi said the celebration should be a village tradition. Nelly argued with her, insisting on a restaurant. Matthew intervened when the relatives got to the point of discussing the festive table. "No one is getting married yet. It's too early to plan hot salads," he calmly reassured them. "Women should plan ahead," Nelly replied. That's right, Aunt Lexi said. "What if I don't have enough pickles?" Tiana laughed out loud. Everyone else laughed too. It was past midnight when they decided to call it a night. Matthew took his mother into the house. Nelly was tired from the events, the long journey, and the revelations, so she fell asleep, barely touching her pillow. Tiana and Aunt Lexi were clearing the table. The woman suddenly froze as she carried the plates into the house. "What is it, Auntie?" Tiana asked, noticing it. "I told you that Pebble was good luck," sneaky Aunt Lexi said with a sly squint. "Now it's going to decorate the second wedding." Tiana looked at her reflection in the glass of the veranda, where her face was reflected in the bright lantern like a mirror. Her hair and earrings with Ural emeralds glistened. After selling her house in the village, Stacy reluctantly walked to her son's apartment, and when she saw the suitcase. Stacy walked down the street, struggling to move her legs. She had just returned from the supermarket where she had received her pension. The elderly woman went to the nearest grocery store. She needed to buy potatoes, some meat, and she was almost out of cereals. And also milk, flour, sugar. The bag was heavy. It hadn't been a weight for Stacy before, though. On the farm, she'd thrown hay with a pitchfork, carried huge boxes, and carried buckets full of milk or water. What a lot of things she'd done. But now Stacy was a little over 70, and age, of course, was taking its toll. Her back often ached, her arms weakened. She dragged the bag from the supermarket with great difficulty, slowly stopping every now and then to catch her breath. A couple of times she was offered help by passers-by and two teenagers with school backpacks on their shoulders. A middle-aged woman and a tall young guy also offered help. But Stacy refused with a smile. She was in no hurry to get anywhere. And these kind people, it was immediately obvious, were in a hurry to do their own thing. So why distract them? Stacy wasn't just walking so slowly because of the heavy bag. She just didn't want to go home, and the place she was going back to wasn't what you'd call a refuge. Her house used to be spacious, bright, cozy, with a large kitchen and a stove, 4 rooms with a front garden, and a carved fence that Stacy's father had put up, with beloved friends and neighbors. Close to home was good for Stacy, though her work was hard. She spent most of her life working on the collective farm, tending the animals and cleaning the pens. She worked double shifts to make sure her son had everything he needed. She would leave in the dark and return when the sun was already setting over the horizon. Her back ached, her arms and legs buzzed. Still, the old woman remembered those times with nostalgia. She felt much happier then than she did now. The November cold rain fell suddenly, without warning in Philadelphia, as if someone upstairs had opened a faucet of ice water. Stacy was in a hurry. The walk seemed to be canceled. She'd have to go home. There was nowhere to go. The rain was picking up and the wind was picking up. No, we can't run home, we have to wait it out. Stacy hurried to the porch of the nearest store. Here, under the canopy, she could stand until the rain stopped, and then she could go home. On the mischievous tiled plaza, people were gathered, cheerful children, for whom the sudden fall downpour was another adventure, and frowning adults, late for their business because of the rain. Stacy's gaze suddenly fell on a young boy. He stood with his back against the wall, staring blankly at the street. Bright birch eyes, sharply defined cheekbones, hair the color of ripe wheat. A real handsome man. He'd probably get a lot of girls. He looked just like Jacob, a guy Stacy had only known for 2 days in her life. That had been almost 40 years ago. And yet the older woman remembered every feature of the man's face, his scent, and the words he'd said to her. Jacob, if he was still alive, had long since forgotten his casual acquaintance. How many of those had he had? Young girls are attracted to good looks. Jacob has no idea that he has played such a role in the life of one of his many admirers. The key guy, the one Stacy was secretly watching, pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and stared at the screen, occasionally running his finger over the display. Whether he was watching a video or reading something. Young people are so dependent on these gadgets these days. Whether that was good or bad, Stacy didn't know. Her youth was very different. Stacy was born into a family of a tractor driver and a milkmaid. When she was only 2 years old, she became the oldest child. Her parents had another daughter named Vivi. The family lived poorly but decently. They did not starve, did not go in old clothes, and did not go to resorts. They did not buy fur coats and luxury cars. Their parents worked hard, so Stacy and Vivi learned early to help around the house. Stacy, observing modern children whom she thought were overprotective of their parents, marveled. She and her sister, at 7 or 8 years old, could already mop the floors, cook lunch and dinner. Moreover, the girls cleaned the yard, took care of the livestock, did their own homework and laundry without reminders. And after all, they did not have modern technical wonders that make life much easier: washing machines, dishwashers, and so on. The girls still had a lot of free time. Having coped with the lessons and finished their homework, the sisters with a clear conscience went to the street to their friends. All their peers lived the same way. They had time to do housework and at school and play with their classmates. Stacy and Vivi were always very friendly, supporting each other. Stacy has the fondest memories of her childhood. Then everything was simple, clear and easy. The future was seen in bright colors. Stacy didn't do well in school. Unlike her little sister, Vivi was a quick learner. Complex formulas were no problem for her. The complex rules of the Russian language seemed to fall into place in her younger sister's head. For Stacy, however, science remained incomprehensible throughout her schooling. She seemed to be trying to learn literacy. She always did her homework. She was not lazy. She did not slack off. But apparently the ability was not given. Vivi understood everything effortlessly. She just had a clear head. Parents were proud of their youngest daughter. Maybe someone from the family will get a higher education, dreamed the mother to get into the people. "Daughter," reasoned the father, "you have a head on your shoulders. It's foolish to miss such a chance. You do your best, and we'll help you." Stacy was proud of her sister too, but it hurt her to hear her parents say that. It turned out that her parents really hoped more for Vivi and expected her to succeed in her studies and career. They didn't count on Stacy for that. Vivi tried hard, studied hard, and never bullied her sister. On the contrary, she helped Stacy with her lessons. When Stacy was faced with assignments that were difficult for her, the sisters grew up. Stacy went to study in the city, went to college, choosing a specialty of sewing technologist. The girl has always had an aptitude for needlework. She realized that she would become a good tailor. Wright approved the choice of the eldest daughter's father. "The specialty is wonderful. You will not be left without a piece of bread. You have golden hands." Agreed the mother. Bon voyage. After her studies, Stacy decided to stay in the city. She got a job in an attire, rented an apartment nearby, started taking part-time jobs, and soon Stacy was supporting herself. The atelier paid a small salary, but the part-time jobs helped to make a dress, a coat, a tablecloth, or something else. Stacy did not sit without work and money. Meanwhile, Vivi was studying law at university. How proud her parents were of her success and told their acquaintances about it. For the eldest daughter, they were calm, hard-working Stacy will not be lost. But they were really proud of their youngest daughter, Vivi, who was smart and beautiful, and was also studying at university. Stacy was genuinely happy for her sister. What could she do? She herself was not given to gnaw on the granite of science, but she had golden hands, and it was noted by everyone. As time went on, Stacy's friends were getting married, but it didn't seem to be working out for her. She wasn't attracted to the guys she liked, and for some reason the guys Stacy liked preferred other girls. When she heard about her friends' and classmates' weddings, Stacy worried that she might end up alone, an old maid. Her parents only added fuel to the fire, asking each time their eldest daughter arrived, "When will she get married? When children? When will you settle down?" Vivi's parents were in no hurry to get married. For one thing, she was the youngest daughter. As long as her older sister didn't get married, Vivi didn't have to worry about it. Secondly, she was still in school, and after graduation she was going to go to graduate school. Her parents saw her in their dreams as a university teacher or even a professor. From the eldest, Stacy, they just expected human happiness, to meet a cheerful, good-natured husband, to have favorite grandchildren. Stacy was almost desperate. She looked at every guy in her neighborhood as a potential spouse and evaluated young people only from this position. Of course, such obsession did not go unnoticed and scared men away. Once there was a dance at the House of Culture. Stacy went there with her friends. She didn't like dancing very much, and loud music gave her a headache. But you could meet someone at the dance. Galia, her friend, found a husband there. They were living together now, expecting their first child. Stacy wanted the same, the love of a husband, a child, simple human happiness. She put on her best dress, tight, short, revealing her slender legs, curled her hair into curls, painted her eyelashes and lips. After looking at herself in the mirror and being satisfied, she slipped out of the house. Stacy didn't have much hope for anything, because she went to the dance once every 2 or 3 months and always came back with nothing. But that night was different, magical, amazing. Jacob had noticed one of Stacy's friends, Penelope, a blue-eyed beauty. He approached their company, seemed to be getting to know everyone, but kept his eyes on Penelope. Stacy realized she was missing. When she saw the stranger's turquoise eyes, merry, mischievous, and sly, and his smile that would drive anyone crazy, she fell in love. Jacob was witty and fun to talk to. He felt confident, not embarrassed, unlike so many of the other guys in Stacy's company. And she herself, of course, was mesmerized by him. Stacy envied Penelope. She wished that this young man was looking so interested in her, and not her friend. She would have given a lot for that. But Jacob asked Penelope one dance, then another. Stacy watched them enviously from a distance. She saw the boy try several times to hold Penelope tighter to him than was proper. His hands kept slipping below her waist. Penelope, embarrassed, tried to pull away. Stacy didn't understand her. What was all this modesty and childish behavior? They were adults, they had already graduated, they were working. After another dance, Penelope slipped outside for some fresh air. Stacy understood that. She had been frightened by her beau's pressure, so she'd found an excuse to run away. Stacy had been watching the couple all evening and could see what was going on. Jacob hurried after his lady, but Stacy got in his way. Slow music was playing. "Shall we dance?" Stacy smiled at the boy. It was a desperate and bold move. Stacy had never acted like this before, but now it was as if someone was leading her by the hand. The girl suddenly felt relaxed, confident. There was no doubt in her mind that Jacob would agree to dance with her. And so he did. He stared at Stacy for a moment, as if trying to remember who she was. But of course, Jacob had only been looking at Penelope when he met her. He didn't care about the others, but the next second he was smiling radiantly at Stacy, making her heart race and her palms sweat. And he held out his hand to her. They danced in each other's arms. Stacy melted in his warm embrace. When the music stopped, he even kissed the girl. Of course, it wasn't the first kiss in Stacy's life, but she had never had that reaction before. Stacy felt dizzy and her eyes darkened. She wished Jacob could hold her like this for the rest of her life. She didn't care if he kissed and hugged her in front of everyone. Let them watch, let them be jealous. And she didn't care what or who thought of her. "Why don't we go for a walk?" Jacob suggested in a slightly husky voice. Stacy was all for it. She wanted to be alone with him too. They walked through the city at night, holding hands. Jacob said something about himself, then asked Stacy questions about her life. When he learned that she lived alone, he offered to go to her. Stacy agreed without hesitation. In the evening and at night, Stacy played a very pleasant role for herself. She imagined that she and Jacob were husband and wife who loved each other and were going to live together for the rest of their lives. It was a pleasure to be near this man, to take care of him. How happy was it to fall asleep next to the one she loved? Jacob was already asleep, but Stacy lay there, staring at the ceiling, savoring the warmth of a loved one. His peaceful breathing, the silence, the stillness. Just the two of them. Magical. Stacy realized she was in love like she had never been in her life. She never knew she was capable of such feelings. Stacy didn't know much about Jacob. He told her he lived in another city. Which city? He didn't mention. He'd tell her tomorrow. Guy came here to visit a friend. They were in the army together. This coworker had a wedding recently, so he invited Jacob. Witnesses like Jacob's leaving soon. But now everything's changed. They've met each other. Jacob isn't going anywhere, and if he does, he'll probably take her with him. The way he'd been looking at her all night. Those looks were the spark that had ignited between them, and that rarely happens. How lucky they were to meet each other at the dance. In the morning, Stacy woke up to someone rattling pans in the kitchen, but caught the scent of scrambled eggs. Stacy stretched in bed and smiled, remembering the events of the previous evening. It's Jacob. He's making them breakfast. How wonderful and romantic this is. Before meeting her lover, Stacy peeked into the bathroom. She washed her face, lightly brushed her hair to look casual, touched up her lipstick and lightly pinched her cheeks, causing a blush. She wanted to look her best in front of Jacob. He'd made her scrambled eggs, and there was ham frying in the skillet. "Good morning," he smiled. "I've been tending to your place for a while. Nothing, I was just hungry." "It's for the best." Stacy smiled radiantly. Breakfast almost in bed. How romantic. "Why don't you come on? I'll take care of you." Jacob took out a plate, deftly placed a piece of scrambled egg on it, and sprinkled greens on top. Stacy watched his every move as if mesmerized. Her heart beat joyfully in her chest. She had finally met her man. And what a man. Beautiful, intelligent, attentive, caring. They ate breakfast in silence. Jacob seemed pensive. He was obviously thinking about something, and Stacy didn't want to distract him. "Thank you for tonight," he finally broke the silence. "I have to go. I have to stop by Layton's, pack my things, and get to the train station. The train's coming." Stacy felt like she'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. How come? Is he leaving already? What about her? I mean, they're so happy, so cozy together. "Are you leaving already?" she asked in a distressed voice. "Didn't I tell you?" Jacob was surprised. Then he smiled his charming smile. Yeah, well, we didn't have much to talk about last night. I thought you were staying, Stacy admitted. I would have. You're great, aren't you? But the train's in 3 hours and there's a lot to do. We'll see each other again. Stacy struggled to keep the tears from coming to her eyes. She'd already figured it out from Jacob's look and his tone. It was an illusion, their feelings and sparks. The situation that Stacy and Jacob found themselves in was fairly typical and common. They obviously had different expectations for this encounter. For Jacob, it was an easy one-night adventure with no commitment. He was honest and didn't intentionally deceive Stacy. He just didn't specify all the details because of the romantic atmosphere. On the other hand, Stacy fell in love very quickly and began to build illusions about a serious relationship and a future together. She herself invented a beautiful love story, although Jacob did not promise anything like that. When the truth came out, it was a painful disappointment for Stacy. But she'd done the right thing, not to make a scene, but to keep her dignity. Jacob had been good in his own way too, apologizing, explaining the situation, and not making empty promises. In this kind of casual romance, it is important to be sober about the situation and the expectations of both parties. Avoid naive illusions and do not build air castles. But if feelings have awakened, do not be ashamed of them or suppress them. The main thing is to maintain respect for yourself and your partner. Accept the situation as it is. Extract from it a positive experience, not bitterness of resentment. Life goes on, and new love adventures and meetings may be waiting ahead. The situation Stacy finds herself in is indeed a difficult one. An unexpected pregnancy after a casual liaison puts before her a difficult choice, on which her whole future life depends. On the one hand, she dreams of motherhood, and at her age this may be her last chance to have a child, plus a child from a man for whom she had warm feelings. Igor has shown himself to be an attentive and caring man, albeit for a short time. On the other hand, Jacob is clearly not expecting and not ready for fatherhood after a fleeting affair. Raising a child alone will be very difficult, both morally and financially, and the pregnancy itself in her position a great stress. To make a decision on abortion is also not easy. In addition to ethical worries, it can negatively affect health and further fertility. In such a situation, it is very important to soberly consider all options, listen to your heart, but also objectively assess your strength and capabilities. Consult with close people who can support. And having made a decision, do not torture yourself with doubts and guilt. No matter how difficult the situation may be, life goes on. Perhaps in the future Stacy will have the opportunity to become a mother under more favorable circumstances. Or maybe this experience will help her better understand her true desires and priorities. The main thing is to move forward, drawing strength from her informed choices. Stacy had never met one before at all. She couldn't think of a better candidate for fatherhood. No, of course, Jacob won't be involved in the baby's life. He wouldn't even know he existed. No way. They'll never meet again. And yet, such a heredity. If the baby turns out to be as beautiful, it's a dream come true. Stacy felt she couldn't get rid of the baby, even with the hardships that threatened her. The fate of a single mother is unenviable, but it's better than being all alone. Having no children at all is even worse. In general, Stacy hesitated for a while and then made a difficult decision for herself. She leaves the child and will try her best to give the baby a good childhood. She has a profession. Parents, in case of anything, will definitely help. They are loving, reliable. So the baby will be. The decision has been made. Stacy felt inner peace and began, at last, to really enjoy the life, rapidly developing under her heart. At this time, Vivi, the younger sister, had finished graduate school and received her degree. Not only that, she was invited to work overseas for a large company doing research. This was something incredible in Stacy's eyes. Vivi, her little sister, had made it to such heights. A dizzying career, interesting work, recognition awaited her. And she, Stacy, would soon be a single mom. Her parents talked of their youngest daughter's impending departure. They were proud of her, proud of Vivi again, and had no idea that their eldest daughter would soon make them happy that she was about to become a single mom. Against the backdrop of her sister's success, for which Stacy was certainly very happy, her own life seemed a complete failure. Vivi drove away. She called her parents and sister, occasionally sending letters with pictures in them. Vivi had changed. There was a hardness in her face that made the girl even more beautiful and attractive. Beautiful, smart, just a dream. And Stacy had her own life going on. A few months passed, and it was impossible to hide the pregnancy. At work, they figured it out. The boss wasn't particularly happy that one of his seamstresses was going on maternity leave. Now he was nagging Stacy about her work and kept insinuating that she wouldn't be welcome at work because a single mom would be taking sick leave all the time. Who would have to work then? All of this was unsettling to Stacy. She understood that the case is going to be dismissed because the labor code carefully protects pregnant employees. But there are always loopholes, so the boss found one. One day he simply closed the attire, terminating its existence. Accordingly, all female employees lost their jobs, but only for one day, because the firm went bankrupt only on paper. In fact, it continued to function without stopping. The very next day, the boss took the dressmakers back to their old jobs. All except Stacy. A pregnant employee and then a single mom with a small child were of no use to the boss. Stacy was out of work and destitute. She had no savings. She couldn't even pay her rent. Nowhere to go. Stacy had to go back to her parents in the village and confess everything to them. Her mother and father were surprised to hear her daughter's story, but not particularly upset, even seemingly on the contrary. "Do not worry, we'll get through," her father soothed, stroking Stacy's head like a little girl. "We won't fall through. It's not those times. We'll be fine," echoed the mother. "You have a baby, we'll help raise it. Children are happiness." Her parents didn't seem bothered by the difficulties ahead or the inevitable gossip from the neighbors. Stacy understood why this was the case. They had a successful youngest daughter. Even Stacy's life mistakes paled in comparison to Vivi's accomplishments. On the one hand, it made life easier for the mother-to-be, but on the other hand, it made her feel even more ridiculous and stupid. As always, against Vivi's background, Stacy was losing badly. Frustrating, painful, but familiar. At the due date, Stacy's son Ben was born. The new mother spent hours looking at his red, wrinkled face, trying to see if he looked like Jacob. She wanted him to look like his father, to be as handsome, as charming, as charismatic. It didn't work. Ben didn't have those deep birch eyes or the open smile that made his cheeks dimple. Ben was just an ordinary boy, short, skinny, black-haired, like his grandfather. Stacy was a little hurt that her son hadn't inherited his father's good looks. But it didn't affect her feelings for the little boy in any way. Stacy adored Ben. The first time she saw her baby, she realized that from now on all her actions, all her life would be only for his sake, for the sake of this little man. While Ben was a baby, Stacy was supported by her parents. How could they not? Government payments are minimal, no husband, no savings, no job in sight. Who wants an employee with a baby in her arms? So the parents fed both their daughter and their adored grandchild. Stacy didn't want to be on their backs, so as soon as the opportunity arose, she took a job as a farm laborer. Ben was too young for kindergarten. He was left in the care of his grandparents. They were very fond of him. But Stacy decided to work. After all, her baby needed the best toys, the best clothes, the best travel. She accepted that Ben was growing up without a father, but the boy should not be in need because of his own mother's carelessness. The work was hard and physically exhausting. To make a good living, she had to work double shifts, but at least Stacy had money. Now she went into town with Ben every weekend. They sat in cafes, went on rides, went to the movies, and of course visited toy stores. Stacy often let her son choose what he wanted: expensive radio-controlled cars, imported construction equipment, huge sets of soldiers. Stacy literally bent over backwards at work for this, but most importantly, the happy gleam in her only child's eyes. "Why do you shake your head sometimes?" Dad asked. "You can't do that. Everything is for Ben. You forget about yourself. And you're still young." "I don't want anything," Stacy shrugged. "I just want my son to be happy." "Son, it's time you taught him to work," teased his father. "He doesn't clean up his plate or his room." The grandmother objected. "You do everything for him." Spoiled the boy. "It's not good for him. It's not good for a man." No, Stacy's mother intervened. "A loving grandmother will still have time to teach him to work. Let him enjoy his childhood for now." Stacy fully shared her mother's opinion and supported her. Her father just waved his hand at the women's arguments and silently went outside. Sometimes he would say something like, "Can't you argue with me?" Stacy was annoyed by her father's behavior at the time. It wasn't until a decade later that she realized how right he was. Blinded by her love for her only son, Stacy hadn't seen or noticed much. Now they're reaping the rewards. Ben grew up a bright but lazy boy. At school, he'd grasped everything quickly at first and was an excellent student without much difficulty. Stacy hoped he'd taken after his Aunt Vivi. She already held a position in the scientific academy, published in journals, and was almost a celebrity, at least in scientific circles. But it is impossible to ride out all the school years on one cleverness and memory. It was time to work, to teach, to delve into complex formulas, to make an effort. That's what Ben didn't want to do. And the problems began: twos, absences, unwillingness to go to this stupid school at all. Ben gave a lot of arguments for the fact that in the modern world a person can get a good job without education. And Stacy's heart was bleeding from the fact that her son was wasting his abilities in such a stupid and talentless way. The strict grandfather tried to educate his stubborn grandson. This time the mother and grandmother did not interfere with him, kept aside. But it was too late. For Ben, there were no more authorities. The boy got mixed up with a bad bunch of teenagers from dysfunctional families. Stacy talked to her son a lot, tried to call him to order, but it was all in vain. Ben was convinced that he knew best how to behave. "But what can you teach me?" he questioned his mother. "You live in poverty. You have no education. All your life you worked on the farm for pennies. Your parents should have brought you up." By example, you know? "I don't want a life like yours," Ben said to Stacy's mother. "Your example wasn't a good one. There are other ways." Stacy had nothing to say to her rapidly growing son. All she could do was hope that he would be all right, that he would grow up and wise up. The year Ben was to graduate from high school, Stacy experienced many losses. First, just after New Year's Eve, her father passed away. He'd long had a strange cough and difficulty breathing, but he'd written it off as a lifelong smoker. It turned out to be his heart. The heart attack happened in the morning. The ambulance didn't even make it to the hospital. After his grandfather's death, Ben went wild. The man, though elderly, had kept him in check. Now it's like he's got no brakes. He could disappear nights with new friends, come home drunk and demand money from his mother and grandmother for entertainment. Ben became rude, abrasive, a total stranger. Neither persuasion nor threats worked on him. Stacy, who was still longing for her father, felt she was losing her son. And only his mother gave her hope with her words that the boy was mad because he was growing up at that age, without a father. "The boy is difficult, nothing to him. He will soon calm down." "I have seen a lot of such cases in my life," said the grandmother. And indeed, by the middle of the year, Ben had suddenly grown up sharply. He had just graduated from high school, had received his certificate with C's, and he had received his grades only for his past merits, and that was thanks to his mother, who at the end of the year ran after the teachers and the school administration with gifts. Ben seemed to appreciate that his mother and grandmother had done a lot for him, and even apologized to them. Stacy's heart sang with joy. Mom had been right. Growing up, Ben changed. "I decided to go to City College to be a welder. It's a great trade," he announced. His mother and grandmother approved of his choice. They would have been happy with any decision Ben made. The main thing was that the boy realized the importance of education. Ben would learn, he would get a profession, he would have a good, settled life. He left without difficulty, went to college, started an independent life in a college dormitory. Stacy breathed a sigh of relief. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And then another blow hit. On New Year's Eve, the elderly Vivi fell ill. Fever, cough. No big deal, just the usual seasonal cold. Stacy nursed her back to health, but her grandmother got worse and worse. They called the doctor. He immediately heard wheezing in her lungs. Vivi was admitted to the hospital with a diagnosis of bilateral pneumonia. Stacy was scared, of course, but pneumonia is a serious thing. Only Grandma is in the hospital, under the care of doctors. Stacy didn't think anything bad, but one morning she got a call from the hospital with the terrible news that Vivi was gone. During the night, the seizures began. In just 1 year, Stacy had lost both parents, her support, her reliable rear end. It seemed to her that she had been knocked out from under her feet. She was left alone with this cruel world, with a complicated life and a difficult teenager Ben. How she wished now that Jacob, the father of her child, was there. Yes, she still remembered him fondly and lovingly. Stacy needed a solid shoulder to lean on in this difficult situation. But there was no such person, there just wasn't. Vivi was far away. Sure, she would come for a while to say goodbye to her mom. But she'd go straight back to her vibrant, eventful life. And Jacob, of course, wouldn't remember Stacy anymore. I wonder how his life turned out. Surely he is happily married, raising his children, not even realizing that somewhere there is another son, so in need of attention and care. Time passed. Stacy was adjusting to her new life. The son went to study in the city. The woman still worked double shifts to make sure Ben had everything he needed. Ben needed clothes, food, textbooks, and extra classes. The young man still needed to go out and have fun after all. It is the time of college, when, if not now. And life in the city is not cheap. Her son wasn't working yet, so Stacy did her best for her only child, bending her back and transferring most of her paycheck to Ben. Doesn't she need much? But for Ben, whose life was just beginning, Stacy wanted to provide everything he needed. If you brought a man into this world, you'd better provide for him. It was oddly dreary to be in an empty house. No one to discuss the news of the day with. Ben, of course, was called almost every night. He answered his mother's questions that he was fine, always in a hurry. It was understandable, being young. Stacy took no offense, but she often felt lonely and abandoned. Edward, a former classmate who was already a widower, began courting Stacy during this period of her life. He worked as a driver for the administration. Once upon a time, Edward had chased Stacy with flowers and compliments. It was back in high school. Funny, Stacy recalled, insecure, ridiculous, kind of anxious, but touching. Back then, young Stacy had dreamed of guys like Jacob, handsome, stylish, smart. And Edward, he was too plain, ethereal, puny, and wearing glasses. Of course, Stacy was pleased by the boy's attention. It flattered her ego, to be sure. But anything serious with him was out of the question. Time passed. Edward had grown from a teenager into a rather attractive man. He married a girl a grade below him, Trixie, whom Stacy had been friends with as a child. They weren't close friends, but they often hung out together, talking, sharing secrets. Edward and Trixie's family was exemplary. They were both quiet, hardworking, polite. It was hard to imagine either of them raising their voices at their spouse or children. Stacy was happy for her childhood friends. Edward and Trixie had a son and a daughter. They raised their children, worked, flew to the sea every summer. Full house, affluence, love, prosperity. Stacy looked at this happy couple with a smile, and was happy for them, and a little envious. That was the kind of family she wanted to have, preferably with Jacob. But it hadn't worked out. Except that Edward and Trixie's happiness had been short-lived. Young and seemingly healthy Trixie suddenly began to wither. She was literally melting away. She became thin, weak. Edward took his wife to hospitals trying to help her. The cause, of course, was found some complex genetic disease had debuted, but the doctors just threw up their hands and gave disappointing prognosis. There was no help. As a result, Edward was left alone with 2 children in his arms. True, his son and daughter were already old enough, but still the whole village supported the inconsolable widower. Stacy even cooked dinners for the orphan family. And then the man pulled himself together and took care of the household himself. So slowly he raised the children, put them on their feet, educated them. Both of them were already working and living in the city. Edward was in no hurry to move closer to his children. His elderly parents were still in the village, so he looked after them. When Ben left for school, Stacy began to notice that Edward was around more and more often, walking her home after work, chatting about this and that, or helping her carry her bags from the store. It was as if he was accidentally in her way. Stacy didn't mind this pleasant company. They talked about the news, reminisced about their childhood, laughed. One day she invited Edward to tea. He met her after work, as was his custom, and walked her to the gate. The man agreed and came in. Finally, Edward decided to have a serious conversation. It was obvious that he was not taking this step lightly. "Stacy, I've always liked you, you know," he said. "Well, when was that?" Stacy smiled. She hadn't realized what Edward was getting at then. It seemed to her that they were just reminiscing about their childhood again. It had been a long time ago, hadn't it? Edward agreed. Then he looked at her seriously and added, but nothing had changed since then. Stacy looked at the man questioningly. She didn't know what to say. But the sensation of this unexpected confession was clearly pleasant. It sent shivers down her spine and warmed her heart. I've had a crush on you since I was a kid. Since the 6th grade, Edward continued. I decided to admit it in high school. And then I backed off. I pretended I didn't care, but I didn't, and I didn't. And the truth is, I was in a lot of pain. I used to sneak looks at you, admire you. I'd get jealous if any of the guys were around. And I dreamed that when I graduated from high school, I'd get rich and come after you in a cool car. Then you'd pay attention to me. Stacy smiled. The confession seemed naive and sweet. She hadn't noticed anything. Edward smiled too, remembering his young, ambitious self. But it didn't work out, the man continued. I couldn't get into university. I didn't have enough brains. I studied to be a driver and returned to the village. Of course, I found out about you. Some acquaintances told me you lived in the city. They said you had someone. Well, I didn't doubt it. Such a beauty. How could you not have fans lining up? I bet they did. Stacy couldn't take it anymore and laughed out loud. Edward, living here in the village, thought I was a horde of suitors. I was lonely and jealous of my married friends. Oh, you don't know how wrong you were. Yes, I was a young fool. Edward grinned. Anyway, I decided that the train had finally left. Edward, you were under the illusion that I had a rich fiancé in town and tons of admirers. In reality, I was lonely and jealous of my married friends. You're in town, and you have a rich fiancé who lavishes you with gifts, Edward said bitterly. I should have checked, and I suffered and felt my own inadequacy. Who was I? Just a driver. And you're a princess? A queen, an unattainable ideal. No match for me. Edward was in almost physical pain at the time. The girl he had been in love with since childhood would never be his. At the time, it seemed like there was nothing to live for. The guy worked and ate, went out with friends. The world was somehow gray and faded. Everything seemed meaningless. And then it suddenly became clear that the neighbor's daughter Trixie was attracted to him, to Edward. It was an amazing discovery for the boy. Someone could love him for who he was, not too pretty, not too successful. Anya had gone from a skinny girl to a lovely young woman. Big clear eyes, thick long hair, thin waist. Trixie graduated from a teacher's college in the city and returned to her hometown. She was now teaching school, tutoring first graders. She walked briskly toward Edward that evening, returning from work. She caught up with her neighbor at the gate and told him to his face how she felt. I was stunned, Edward recalled with a smile. It was unexpected, and I felt sorry for her. I'd been in the same position myself. I knew how hopeful she was, how important my attention was to her. And I knew how much my indifference would throw her off. How could I do that to a fragile girl in love? Anyway, Edward and Trixie started dating, getting to know each other better and realizing every day that they were a great couple. I thought nothing good was going to happen in my life, Edward said. It was as if Trixie had pulled me out of my cocoon, showing me that happiness was still possible. Edward and Trixie married and had children. And then? Then you came back to the village, confused and pregnant, Edward said to Stacy. How I wanted to be there for you, to support you. But it was too late. We were married, and we had babies. Did you still love me then? Stacy wondered. Of course I did, Edward answered. I still do. But I couldn't show my feelings then. I already had obligations to Trixie and the children. I loved all three of them very much, and I couldn't betray my family, not even for my own happiness. Were you unhappy? Stacy asked in surprise. Edward's revelations had shaken her to the core. I couldn't say. Trixie was wonderful. I loved her in my own way, took care of her. I was good to her. But with you, even now, I can't describe how I felt and how I feel. They sat for a while longer. Edward stared at Stacy, waiting for some sign from her. She didn't understand her own feelings. She was pleased that there was someone who loved her so much. It made her feel warm. After the death of her parents, Stacy was left all alone, a son in town, a sister abroad. There were no people who cared about her, who tried to please her, who were interested in her well-being. And then there was Edward. In love, devoted, good, reliable. But something was stopping Stacy, Ben. How would he feel about this turn of events? He'd probably disapprove, say her mother had gone crazy and was having an affair in her old age. Only the desire to be with someone she cared about gradually overcame her doubts. Stacy often thought about how nice it would be if they lived together. Edward would be happy, that was for sure. And it felt good to know that you could make someone so happy. Anyway, that night, the former classmates decided to try to become a couple. "I'll ask you out tomorrow," Edward summarized with a smile. "The dream of my youth would finally come true." "It will come true." Stacy nodded like Trixie's wife. The next day they went into town. They wandered through the park, talking, sitting in cafes, and then they went to a movie theater. Edward took Stacy's hand during the movie and held it for an hour and a half until the movie was over. The woman didn't mind. She liked the feeling. She was finally not alone. A week later, Edward moved in with her. He fixed the leaky faucet and tightened the hinges on all the interior doors. They were finally squeak-free. And Stacy started cooking for herself again. She was too lazy to do it alone, but now Edward was with her, and she was making him happy with delicious meals. The only question on Stacy's mind was how Ben would feel about all this. He didn't know yet, did he? His son rarely came to visit his mother, and they talked on the phone more and more. She had been stalling, not telling Ben about the changes in her life. Edward had told both his son and daughter at once. Stacy realized they were happy for their father. She wished her own son would react the same way, but there was little hope of that. Several years passed. Stacy still hadn't decided to have a serious conversation with her son. Hiding the details of her personal life wasn't difficult. The son had little interest in what was going on with his mother. He usually only called to ask for money. But one day, Ben came to visit. It was surprising. The son hadn't graced his mother with his presence for a long time, and now he showed up. Hi, Stacy was both excited and a little confused. Edward hadn't come home from work yet, but his things were everywhere. It was impossible to ignore the fact that someone else was living in the house now. Hi, Ben said glumly. He didn't look well, gaunt, pale, anxious. I need money, he said. Stacy knew right away that something serious had happened. What's going on? She asked, clutching at her heart. Something stabbed in her chest. Is it something with school? I haven't studied in a long time, Ben muttered under his breath. How come? They expelled me for truancy. I've been working hard and you don't get any money, he said rudely. I sent you most of your paycheck every month, Stacy reminded him. That's good money for the city. It's nothing, Ben sighed. I didn't have enough. So I did the best I could. Other people's parents are well-to-do. They have cars and apartments and money for fun. Did I feel like a beggar all the time? You think that's nice? It hurt Stacy to hear those words. She'd worked her whole life for her son. She wanted Ben to have the best of everything. And now this is what happens. He thinks he's miserable. So Stacy's not doing her job as a parent. Ben even dropped out of college. So what now? Stacy asked. Did he go into debt? I wanted to start a business, make some money, Ben explained. I ended up in debt. They're charging me a lot of money. They're threatening to kill me. Where am I going to get it? So I came to you for help, Mom. You know I ain't got nothing. What do you mean you don't have anything? Ben was surprised. What about the house? Do you want us to sell the house? Well, what's the solution, Mom? I'll pay off my debts and rent an apartment. We'll live in the city. Why are you going to take a well-deserved vacation soon? There's no couch in town, of course. But I'll get you a job in an attire. My grandmother told me that you used to be a seamstress, and now this labor pays well. We'll live together in town, like we used to. Wouldn't that be nice? Stacy couldn't agree with her son. A couple of years ago, she would have happily supported Ben's idea. Living alone in an empty house was unbearable. But now she had Edward. They were good together. It was nice to have someone who loved and understood. And now what? Ben finally noticed the men's things in the rooms. Edward's jacket hung on the wall, his pants were on the table. There were size 43 sneakers by the front door. "What are those?" Ben asked, looking at his mother in amazement. "Did you have someone in your life?" "I've been wanting to tell you for a long time," Stacy said. "It's just something that happened here." Ben nodded his head understandingly and sighed sadly. "My personal life is getting better." "Yeah, well, of course you don't have a son to worry about." "You know I'm not." Stacy objected softly. She could see that Ben was depressed and in trouble. He needed help, and she, the mother, would certainly lend him her shoulder in his time of need. Who else would? "Son, I'll do whatever you say." And Stacy did. She sold the house, gave most of the proceeds to her son. With the rest, she bought a tiny apartment in an old house on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Edward offered options, wanted to give Ben his savings. It was less than he needed, but it was still a decent amount. Stacy didn't agree. Edward shouldn't have to solve her problems. Their problems. He had children of his own. Using a man in a situation like this is despicable. "Stay with me," Edward asked Stacy. "You're packed, your suitcases are waiting for tomorrow morning. Ben has ordered a cab for you by 10 o'clock. "You know I can't," Stacy replied. "I know, but I don't understand. You gave him money, you bought him a place to live. But why would you want to be there yourself? Stay with me. I've got a big house, plenty of room, you know. We had a good time together, didn't we?" "We were," agreed Stacy. Yes, in the few years she'd lived with Edward, the woman had grown accustomed to warmth, to caring, to understanding. It was very pleasant. They walked together in the evenings, discussing things. Edward looked at Stacy with loving eyes, and she felt happy. But now everything was different. Stacy could see that her son was not well. Too anxious, too restless. Something bad is clearly going on in his life. Yes, Ben is an adult, and Edward is partly right when he says he should be able to deal with his own problems. But when Stacy was in a difficult situation, she didn't deal with her problems on her own. Stacy's parents had helped her a lot in the past. Edward assured her that this was a different story. A young, single woman with a baby in her arms and a grown man who'd been given money from the sale of her house by her mother. Stacy couldn't agree with him. It's fine for him to talk. He's got both his son and his daughter graduated, working good jobs, with families. There was no telling how Edward would behave if one of his children was in a situation like Ben's. Stacy was also afraid of losing her last place to live. Now that she didn't have the house she'd spent her childhood in, she was beginning to worry about growing old. It wouldn't be long before she would be elderly and possibly helpless. What would she do without a corner of her own if Ben could not be looked after? He's going to lose that apartment in the old building too. And we need to find out what's going on in his life. Maybe we should save his son. It's about time. He's not going to admit it himself. But when they start living together, Stacy will realize it, see it for herself. She can't leave her only child alone with his troubles and problems. "Why are you so worried?" Stacy smiled at Edward. It was a sad smile. The woman understood, even without the mirror. "I'm not moving to the moon or even to another continent. The city's close by. Distance is no barrier to feelings. Shall we meet, socialize?" Of course, Edward sighed. "But it's not the same thing, you know. It's just the way life works." Stacy moved to LA and was eager to get settled into her new place. There was only one room in the apartment. It went to Ben, of course. Stacy took the kitchen. She bought herself a cot, which she put by the window at night and put away in the closet in the morning. Edward came often at first. They walked along the promenade, as they had before, and sat in cafes. With him, Stacy felt invaluable, important, loved, not like at home. Edward had urged her to move in with him. "But if you don't want to move in with me, let's go somewhere else," he suggested. Svetlana moved to the city to be near her son Matvey and to help him. She soon discovered that Matvey had a serious problem with alcoholism. He was drinking a lot, coming home late at night or in the morning. At first, Svetlana was very worried about her son, afraid that something would happen to him because of his drinking. But then she got used to his nocturnal strolls. Svetlana began to take care of the drunk Matvey. In the morning, she brought pills, water, cleaned up after him. Matvey's alcoholism progressed. He degenerated, became stupid, aggressive, helpless. Svetlana blamed herself for her son's problems, believing that the absence of a father and Matvey's unknown origin had an impact. She speculated that Matvey's alcoholism could have been passed on genetically. Svetlana fully supported and served her son. She cooked, cleaned, and bought groceries. Matvey did not work anywhere because of his drinking and lived on his mother's full support. In general, a difficult situation is described when an elderly mother is forced to have full custody of her adult alcoholic son, having given up her personal life. The son degenerates, but the mother cannot abandon him. Ben didn't bother to work. After a while, the son started demanding money from Stacy when he didn't have enough to drink. And this happened quite often because the man earned a living by rare casual earnings, which fell out infrequently. His soul demanded alcohol on a regular basis. Stacy, feeling sorry for her son, at first gave him money for pocket money and then tried to stop giving money. But Ben still took money from his relative. Sometimes he quietly took money out of his mother's purse. Sometimes he got his way with threats and rudeness. Stacy felt miserable and confused. Living with her own son had become a nightmare. Ben would yell at his mother, sass her for no reason. He would take her money. Therefore, the woman tried, having received a payment, to immediately make a stock of food for a long time. The adult son has not yet raised his hand on his elderly parent. But looking into Ben's empty, embittered eyes, Stacy realized that the moment was not far off. The only outlet for Stacy was her walks with Edward. He still visited her in town whenever he could. The woman didn't talk about her life. It was embarrassing hard. She couldn't share this misery with anyone at all. In front of others, Stacy put on the mask of a prosperous and happy woman. One day, Edward told Stacy news that made her heart ache. "I'm moving soon," he said, looking away. "We won't be able to see each other much." Whereto Stacy sighed sadly. The only person she'd felt human lately was Edward, and now it looked like their meetings were about to end. "To the sea, to Nashville," he answered. "With his son's family. You know, I'm having trouble with my lungs. The doctor told me to change the climate or else. But never mind, my son has decided to move with me. My daughter's still thinking about it. But it looks like she's going to do it too. So that's that." "That's too bad," Stacy said sadly. She tried to fight the tears that had come to her eyes. "Stacy, I'm begging you, please come with me. You helped your son solve problems when he was in a difficult situation. He'll figure it out on his own. He's not a little boy anymore, are you? We'll live by the sea." Imagine how happy that would be. "Think about it," Edward said. Stacy realized she wasn't going anywhere. How would she leave Ben? Edward just didn't know anything about Ben's addiction. He didn't know that he hadn't been making any money for a long time. Without his mother, Ben would be lost, completely lost. And how could she enjoy the sea, the sun, and the company of a loving Edward, knowing that her son is dying alone in a distant city? Edward was gone. Stacy took his absence hard. They called each other, texted each other. Of course, Edward sent pictures of beautiful landscapes and beckoned, still calling Stacy, telling her how good it would be together. But the woman felt responsible for the son she'd given birth to, the one she hadn't raised. So she had to be there for him, to help, to support him. Sometimes because of these thoughts, the woman felt terrible, but she could not do anything about it. A few more years passed. Stacy had grown old. She probably could have looked better and younger, but not with this life. Ben continued to drink and adamantly refused treatment. He started taking company home, and it was much harder than when Stacy waited nights for her son. These marginal-looking people, women, put-down men, laughed loudly in Ben's room. Drinking, arguing, even fighting sometimes. When Stacy tried to talk some sense into her son, he snapped at her. He stopped seeing his mother as a person at all. And then Kate, Ben's common-law wife, showed up at the apartment. There was no hope that she would have a positive effect on her son. Kate was a drinker herself. While Ben usually didn't touch his mother except when he needed money, Kate clung to her mother-in-law on and off. Eventually, she and Ben had managed to turn Stacy against her. He was now convinced that his mother intended to break him up with his beloved and hated Kate. Scolding, quarrels, scandals, all this now waited for Stacy every day. And she hadn't saved her son. She hadn't built a personal happiness with Edward. She could be living with a man who'd loved her all her life on the beach. Dreams, that's all. What about Ben, without her supervision? No, she gave a man life, so she must be responsible for him. Well, I guess that's her fate now. The rain had eased off considerably. Stacy took advantage of the respite to make her way to the driveway. This time she was in a hurry, in case it rained again. She was delaying her return, too, because there was nowhere else to go. It looked like Kate and Ben were having company again tonight. We'd be out till morning in the only room they had. They'll be in the kitchen, of course, going to the fridge. Stacy just filled it with groceries. That's a good thing. We'll probably have to go to the store again tomorrow, if there's any money left. Stacy would lie on her cot all night, pretending to sleep, listening to the sounds of the party in the next room. Her main task now is not to disturb her son, Kate, and their guests. Going up to her floor on foot, there had never been an elevator in this old house. The elderly woman stopped, all the doors as dug in. On the landing stood her suitcases, the same one she had moved here from the village with. Stacy opened one of them. Her belongings lay there. Nothing made sense. The woman tried to open the door with her key. It didn't work. Someone had clicked the lock so it wouldn't unlock from the outside. So Stacy knocked loudly. Their bell hadn't worked in a long time. The door swung open. A happy Kate stood on the doorstep, hands at her sides, feet shoulder-width apart. She was smiling strangely. "What's the matter?" Stacy asked. "Seriously, you old hag," Kate said in a luscious voice. "This is my apartment. Why on earth would I leave? It's not yours, it's Ben's. It's in his name. I saw the paperwork myself the other day. You're nobody here." "Then get out of here," Stacy said. Ben's head peeked out from behind Kate. "Yeah, that's what we've decided. You need to go. You don't give us a life, you're always giving us advice," Ben said. "You mind your own business. Are you trying to break Kate up with me too? We'd better live separately." "What are you going to live on?" Stacy didn't understand. She'd long ago realized that her son had no warm feelings for her, but he needed his mother at least as a source of funding. "You don't know anything, do you?" Kate smirked. "I'm expecting a baby in a couple months. I've already got sick pay, maternity pay. And then every month for the child will be paid, so we're doing great." Stacy glanced at her sister-in-law's figure. Yes, her belly was showing under the sweater, but Kate had never been particularly slender, so the woman didn't notice anything. That's news to her. Ben and Kate are having a baby. Poor baby. What's it like growing up with parents like that? And will that baby ever survive? Stacy's eyes darkened at the news. The news of the baby eclipsed even the fact that she was being kicked out of her own home. She felt unbearably sorry for this unborn baby, grandson or granddaughter. At the same time, the woman realized that she was unable to save him, to make his life even a little easier. It would be better to deal with her own fate. "So get out of here," Kate smiled again. "Son? But where am I supposed to go?" Stacy turned to Ben. "You can't live on the streets. You've got a boyfriend in the village. Go to him." Ben said nonchalantly, "Do you have somewhere else to go?" "I don't understand." Ben didn't know that Edward had moved to another state from where he'd never been interested in his mother's affairs. "And you have a rich sister who won't leave you," Kate added and slammed the door shut. Stacy picked up her suitcases and went outside. What else could she do? There wasn't a single thought in her head about where to go. Edward was far away. Vivi's sister was even farther away. No one wanted her. Lonely, abandoned, now homeless. She must have deserved it somehow. She's ashamed to even tell the people she knows how life turned out. Her own son, for whom Stacy's mother lived, kicked her out of the house. Out of the house. The rain had stopped, but the icy wind had picked up. It burned his cheeks and made his eyes water. It was rapidly getting darker. There were hardly any people on the streets anymore. Stacy was finally exhausted. She set her suitcases down at an empty bus stop, sat on them, and let the tears flow. They poured down her cheeks, and the woman didn't even wipe her face. She wept for her unfulfilled hopes for her son, sobbed for the plight of Ben and her unborn grandson. But their own future, of course, was a source of anxiety and apprehension. Where to go, from whom to ask for help. Staying outdoors on a cold November night was a pleasure, and something would happen. A pleasant young girl's voice came from somewhere behind her. Stacy turned around. A young woman was looking at her. Tall, thin, tight jeans, sneakers, a deep hooded sweatshirt, and eyes. Attentive, sympathetic eyes. Next to the stranger, a small, funny little dog worried, and seemed to look at Stacy with sympathy too. His funny face looked so funny that the older woman couldn't help but smile through her tears. DG was born into a student family. Her mom was an economist, her dad an engineer. The young parents met at a student disco. They noticed each other right away, fell in love, got married. DG was born when both were in their 4th year, each at his own university. The young family was not discouraged. Yes, they didn't earn much yet. Yes, they had to live with their child in a cramped room in the student dormitory. But the couple had so much ahead of them. They dreamed, they planned, they hoped. Digi did not remember her parents at all. She saw their photos, listened to the stories of relatives and acquaintances about these people. And then the image of her mother and father opened up in Digi's mind. Cheerful, energetic, hardworking, a little naive, loving each other and the child. Tragedy struck at a construction site. Digi's mom and dad, trying to earn an extra penny after their studies and main job, were looking for a part-time job. And that time they managed to get a job with a private contractor who was building a sports complex in the city center. The young couple, along with a couple of similar students, were painting the walls, and something happened. Either the cable broke or the platform failed. In general, all 4 of them fell from a height right onto the concrete floor. No one survived. There was no chance. The owner of the construction site managed to get away with it. The students worked for him unofficially. He made it look as if the young people had sneaked into his construction site to take extreme photos or something. A friend of her parents, the family's dormitory neighbor, was babysitting little Digi at the time. The girl spent a few days with her. Then she was supposed to be taken to an orphanage. But her father's sister, Aunt Laura, showed up. She lived in the village, raising her 3 children alone. She wasn't poor, but she wasn't wealthy either. Her family couldn't be called a family. An extra mouth in the form of a niece orphaned overnight was a burden to Aunt Laura. But where to go? What would people say? She abandoned her brother's daughter, sent the child to an orphanage. The neighbors will stigmatize her. They'll remember it for the rest of their lives. That's how Digi ended up in Aunt Laura's family. The girl's childhood was, at first glance, the most ordinary. Digi helped her aunt with the household chores, played outside with her children, and went to school with her friends. But no birthdays with a lot of friends and a cake with candles, no new beautiful dresses, no trips to the amusement park. And no dresses. Digi missed the warmth of the world. Hugs, affectionate words, support. Aunt Laura wasn't strict or mean, but she was not in a hurry to surround her niece with love and care. Aunt Laura had a completely different attitude to her own children. She stroked their heads, hugged them, and found tender words for them. Digi always felt like a stranger to her aunt. She realized that she grew up with the realization of her own unwantedness, and it was a heavy burden for Aunt Laura. Sometimes Digi even felt sorry for her aunt. She was so tired with her work and her own children, and now she had a niece to take care of. Digi dreamed of growing up and having a family of her own. There she would be loved and appreciated. She had always spent a lot of time studying. First, she liked to learn new things, and the girl was quite good at it. She was an excellent student all the years. Secondly, Digi perfectly understood that education is her only chance for a prosperous life. The girl wanted to leave the village, settle in the city, travel the world. For all this, she needed money. So she did her best. After school, Digi entered the university as a translator. She was given a dormitory, and her life of freedom began. Finally, she was no longer a burden to anyone. Digi didn't even pay attention to guys when she was young. She firmly decided for herself, first her career, then everything else. But in her last year of high school, she accidentally met Eugene. He was 8 years older. A well-established, self-confident, handsome, intelligent man came to the university to talk to the rector. Eugene had his own travel agency, and he needed intelligent interpreters. They bumped into each other outside the rector's office. Literally collided. Eugene swung the door open, took a step into the hallway, and crashed into DG, who was walking by. The man immediately picked the girl up, preventing her from falling, and began to apologize. Digi assured him with a smile that she was fine. She was amused by the man's consternation. He acted as if he hadn't accidentally hit her with his shoulder, but had almost hit her with a car. And then, like a corny scene from a novel, their eyes met, and Digi caught her breath. Eugene seemed to feel something too. There was a spark between the young men. Anyway, they went to the window and talked for a long time. They exchanged phone numbers, of course. And in the evening he picked up Digi, and they went for a walk around the city. The girl herself chose such a format of the first date. Digi and Eugene's relationship quickly became close and very serious. Soon the girl moved in with him in a spacious 2-bedroom apartment in the city center. At first, Digi was frightened and confused by the fact that her chosen one is so rich he has his own travel agency, a beautiful car, an expensive apartment. And what is she? A girl from the village, penniless. She doesn't even have parents. An orphan from Kazan, but Eugene was not embarrassed by all this. He looked at Digi with admiring eyes, showered her with gifts and compliments. The girl saw that her presence made him happy and finally allowed herself to just be happy and not worry about anything. After a while, Digi realized she was expecting a baby. Confused, of course. It was too quick and unplanned. Eugene, on the other hand, was genuinely happy. His business was booming. The capital was increasing. The business was growing. Children are happiness, the man smiled, stroking Digi's still quite flat belly. Digi had thought that Eugene would finally propose to her after the news of her pregnancy, but he was in no hurry to take her to the registry office. When she herself asked him about it when they would legalize the relationship, Eugene was genuinely surprised. What for? Well, as the child should have a full family mom, dad. And this child I will recognize legally, do not doubt. And a stamp in the passport, these are such conventions. You know I was married. And the relationship was ruined after I went to the registry office. Then there was so much trouble with the reissuance of documents and so on. So I'm against such conventions. The words of her beloved then shook Digi, but she coped with herself and accepted Eugene's point of view. Really, does it matter if there is a stamp in the passport? What mattered was that they loved each other. Darcy was born on her due date and made Digi the happiest person on earth. The young mother couldn't get enough of her daughter and couldn't believe where such a miracle had come from. Eugene was not a very attentive father. He had been distant since the birth of the child. Only Digi, blinded by the newfound happiness of motherhood, hadn't noticed it right away. One day when Darcy was just 2 years old, the man announced, I'm leaving the apartment to my daughter. I'm going to support her for the rest of her life, and I'm going to keep in touch with the baby too. But I can't live with you anymore. Sorry, I fell out of love, met someone else. It happens. Eugene walked away, leaving Digi feeling upset. She felt like half her heart had been ripped out of her chest. She'd loved Eugene so much, she'd hoped they'd be okay. She had to adjust to the new reality. Eugene hadn't lied, he'd kept his daughter's apartment and was faithfully paying her alimony. But Digi knew she needed to find a source of income. Eugene's money was only for her daughter. Digi needed to work. She needed to establish herself in her profession. As practice had shown, in this life you have to rely only on yourself. Digi realized that, in general, she was still very lucky. Eugene left his daughter an apartment and pays child support. It wasn't much, but it was still money. Still, the pain of the breakup lingered in her chest, and the future looked very dim. I had to get a job. But it so happened that Digi had given birth to a daughter right after the university, so she had no time to get a job. And now, with a small child in her arms and no experience, who needs her? Digi has no relatives, no mom, no sister, no grandmother. No one to look after Darcy while her mother is at work. Send her to daycare. But Darcy would get sick a lot there. An employer wouldn't like an employee who couldn't get enough of sick days. The situation appeared to be a stalemate. That November evening, DG was contemplating her future. DG was wondering how she would ever get a job again. Money was tight, and she had to deny herself everything. She couldn't and wouldn't ask Eugene for more money. He had left them a whole apartment and gave them money to support their daughter. And if DG couldn't provide for herself, that was her problem. After all, she's an adult, not a child. At that moment, Princess Mopisico, the dog Eugene had given to DG when everything was still good with them, asked to go outside. What bad timing. It's dark and cold, and there are puddles all around. It rained a while ago, but where can we go? Princess can't wait. Darcy is already asleep in her room. She won't wake until morning, so DG can calmly walk the dog. The girl quickly dressed, attached the collar and leash to Princess and went out into the November evening. DG noticed the old woman sitting on a suitcase near the bus stop and couldn't believe her eyes. It was too strange. When she got closer, she realized that the old woman was very upset about something. She was crying quietly, not even noticing that her face was already wet with tears. DG's heart squeezed with pity for a stranger who was obviously in great distress. "What's wrong? Do you need help?" she asked. When DG heard Stacy's story, she was horrified. She had longed for a mother, for a close family member. She couldn't imagine how Ben could do this to her mom, her own mom. DG hadn't hesitated for a second in making that offer. The words came out of her mouth before she could think them through. "Let's go to my place now. You're very cold. You need a mug of hot tea. You can't stay outside." A year had passed since that meeting. Stacy had gone to live with DG. On that cold, dark evening over a cup of hot tea, a solution took shape that suited both parties to the unusual story. Stacy now looked after the house and enjoyed spending time with little Darcy, who loved her new grandmother. DG went to work knowing that her daughter was in safe and loving hands. DG finally had someone to love and care for her Stacy. And she was getting the maternal warmth she had missed all her life. And her daughter had a wonderful grandmother who would entertain, feed, and teach. Ben showed up. One day he found out somehow where his mother lived. He demanded Stacy come home, appealed to her sense of family. "Do you value strangers more than your own son?" It happened. Stacy shook her head. "I know that now. Sometimes strangers are closer than family. And I'm not strangers with Digi anymore." Ben kicked Kate out. Their baby was never born. Kate, being pregnant, wasn't about to give up her bad habits. Naturally, her body couldn't take it one day. The baby was born prematurely. It was a very weak and sickly boy. He did not survive. The poor baby's parents' plans for a government welfare check fell through. So Ben came crawling back to his mother. He needed her money again. He still didn't want to work. But this time Stacy was firm. No. Edward was right. Her son was a grown man. She'd done more than she could for him. She'd sold her only home so he could buy an apartment in the city and pay off his debts. Let him take it from there. Speaking of Edward, Stacy told him her story after all. She'd gotten over herself. It made her feel better, and Edward finally understood her. He went to Stacy's house, met DG and Darcy. The four of them had hit it off. It was a nice, warm group of people. Darcy even started calling Edward grandfather. He didn't mind. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy it. Before Edward left, he invited her over. "I look forward to seeing all three of you this summer. No refusal." "No refusal is planned." Stacy smiled. Edward was gone. Summer is coming. DG and Stacy are making plans for a wonderful vacation in Miami. Edward and his whole family are waiting for them. It's going to be a wonderful vacation. And who knows, maybe they'll move to Florida for the vacation and see what's what. DG will try to get a job and take a vacation and get to know the place. They could do it. Why? Living by the ocean surrounded by people you love and love you. Isn't that happiness?